Hi guys. Tonight, we are going to step carefully through the echoing corridors of a medieval castle after dark, when the torches burn low and the stone under your boots feels like a block of ice pulled straight from a river. You hear the faint drip of water seeping down from somewhere above, and you realize quickly that there's no central heating waiting to embrace you. This is not a cozy inn with feather beds and roaring fireplaces in every room. It is a fortress meant for defense, not for comfort. And if you expect to sleep here, you'll need more than bravery. The truth is, you probably won't survive this chill if you wander in unprepared. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, I'd love for you to drop your location and the local time in the comments. I'm always curious where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, let your body sink down, and follow me into the drafty hush of the castle night. You walk beneath a vaulted ceiling where every sound travels: a cough from a distant guard, the shuffle of boots across the flagstones, and even the faint squeak of a mouse scurrying along the wall. The air bites into your cheeks. It's colder inside than out, because the stone walls hold the chill like a sponge soaks up water. Castles were designed first and foremost as strongholds. Comfort came a distant second. Thick walls and narrow windows meant safety from arrows and siege machines, but they also meant very little sunlight during the day and almost no insulation once night fell. Historians often note that the medieval soldier's greatest enemy wasn't always the besieging army. It was the cold within his own fortress. Imagine yourself, not in a luxurious chamber but in the barracks hall, a long room lined with rough wooden pallets or simple straw mats on the ground. A mainstream historical fact is that castles like Dover or Edinburgh devoted enormous square footage to defense but very little to heating arrangements for ordinary soldiers. Fires were usually restricted to the great hall or kitchens, and smoke from open hearths drifted lazily upward, darkening the rafters without ever warming the far corners. If you ended up sleeping in one of those corners, you might as well have been outside. The quirky part of this picture is how creative men became when facing that relentless chill. Chronicles tell of soldiers stuffing their boots with moss or wool scraps, sometimes even with straw, to insulate their feet while they lay down to rest. The smell, as you can guess, wasn't fragrant, but between the damp leather and the straw pressed against sweaty toes, at least you had a buffer against frostbite. Still, historians still argue whether soldiers truly managed to rest peacefully in these conditions, or if most of their nights were spent tossing, shifting, and waking to tend small fires. Some accounts emphasize stoic endurance, while others suggest that entire garrisons were plagued by constant colds and coughs through the winter. The debate comes down to fragmentary records, a passing mention in a steward's account book about extra firewood, or a traveller's complaint of bitter draughts through castle corridors. Your senses sharpen as you picture it. The weight of damp wool clothing clinging to your skin, the faint smoky tang of the hearth carried across the hall, the rough prickling of straw against your neck as you try to settle in. Perhaps a comrade's body presses close on either side, because warmth was shared, whether you wanted it or not. You listen to the rattling breath of a man who fought all day, and now dreams of battle even as he shivers. Beyond the wooden door, the night wind howls, pushing icy draughts through cracks and arrow slits. As you lay here, you wonder, did anyone really sleep deeply in these places? Exhaustion surely helped. Men who marched and labored under heavy armor could collapse anywhere, but the environment, hard floors, damp walls, creeping cold, meant that sleep was rarely comfortable. Even nobles in private chambers pulled their beds away from outer walls to escape the chill radiating off stone. Curtains around the bed weren't just for privacy, but also to trap the little body heat that might build up. For common soldiers, there were no curtains, only each other's presence and whatever scraps of warmth they could hoard. The reality sets in slowly. A medieval castle at night was both fortress and refrigerator. You are wrapped in the stillness, hearing the distant creak of a portcullis chain settling into place. feeling the floor vibrate faintly as a guard above stamps his feet to keep the blood flowing. Your eyes adjust to the shadows. The outlines of wooden beams cross overhead, like the ribs of some enormous beast. Smoke drifts in a faint grey cloud, making your throat dry. But without it, the room would be colder still. Perhaps you chuckle softly to yourself in the dark, because while modern folks complain if hotel rooms dip below 20 degrees Celsius, medieval soldiers considered it normal to wake with frost on their blankets. And yes, that did happen. Recorded accounts from Northern Europe mention soldiers waking to find thin ice forming on the inside of windows, even on the edge of their bedding. It was less a surprise than a fact of life. So you settle in, not expecting luxury, but simply the possibility of surviving until dawn. You tuck your cloak tighter, listen to the rustle of straw, and try to imagine the warmth of a distant summer's day. Cold, hunger, and fear press close. But for tonight, your story has just begun. You drift further into the castle's night, tugging at the layers that cover your body. Without them, you'd be nothing more than another frozen soul in a stone shell. Clothing in the Middle Ages wasn't just about fashion, it was a lifeline. Wool, scratchy though it might feel against your skin, was the soldier's most dependable ally. It trapped air, held warmth, and wicked away just enough moisture to keep you from chilling to the bone. You wrap yourself tighter, feeling how the coarse fibers itch your neck. But you know this discomfort is a small price for survival. A mainstream historical fact is that soldiers and common folk alike relied heavily on thick woolen tunics, hose, and sometimes padded gambesons, not only for battle but also for sleep. Those long, tightly woven garments might smell of sweat and smoke, but they clung to the body like a second skin, holding in every bit of heat. Medieval inventories list endless supplies of wool clothing. So essential was this fabric that armies often demanded it as part of garrison supplies, rather than luxuries like fine meat or ale. The quirky little detail you notice, though, is that people didn't always change out of those clothes when they slept. Instead of pajamas, soldiers often went to bed in the same garments they wore during the day, perhaps only loosening belts and boots. Imagine crawling under a rough blanket while still wearing your armor's padded underclothes, stiffened with sweat and grime. If you wonder about hygiene, well, so did contemporaries, though probably not as much as we would. One tale tells of a nobleman who refused to change his tunic for months, claiming the layers of filth made him warmer. The smell alone must have cleared a room. And here, scholars still puzzle over the layering methods. Did soldiers prefer multiple thinner wool garments, or fewer but thicker pieces? Some argue that thinner layers offered more trapped air and thus more insulation, while others suggest heavy cloaks did the job best. The truth probably varied depending on wealth, region, and season. No single answer applies to every castle or every soldier. As you curl deeper into your own imagined bundle of wool, you sense the heaviness of the fabric pressing on your chest, the faint scent of lanolin still clinging from the sheep it once belonged to. The warmth seeps slowly inward, not like the instant relief of a modern duvet, but more like a gradual thaw spreading from skin to bone. Your fingers brush along the seams where stitches pull taut, uneven, made by a garrison seamstress, or perhaps even by the soldier himself on a long watch. The air in the hall still bites. Around you men shift, coughing, sneezing, sometimes muttering in their sleep, but the wool softens the edge of the chill, allowing you at least to imagine rest. You catch a glimpse of another soldier across the hall, wrapped so tightly in his cloak that only the tip of his nose shows, glowing red from the cold. His breath forms faint clouds, lit by the dying glow of the hearth. You reflect for a moment. In a world before synthetic fabrics, before heated mattresses, before even the concept of central heating, wool wasn't optional. It was survival. And while you may roll your eyes at the itchiness, at least the fibers kept you alive long enough to complain. Now, as you shift to find a more comfortable position, you realize that clothing was only part of the story. What you slept on, and with whom, mattered just as much. The rustle beneath you isn't fabric, it's straw, waiting to scratch and prickle as you turn. But that's a story for the next step of the night. The straw beneath you crackles with every tiny movement, a sound that is both strangely comforting and maddeningly loud in the stillness of the night. You press your hand into the bedding, feeling the uneven crunch of stalks poking through the thin cloth sack meant to contain them. Some stalks are sharp enough to scratch your skin, others bend and soften under your weight. It isn't luxury, but compared to bare stone, it is almost merciful. A mainstream historical fact is that straw mattresses, sometimes called palliaces, were the most common form of bedding for medieval soldiers and even for peasants outside castle walls. These mattresses were nothing more than large canvas or linen sacks filled with straw, hay, or reeds, changed out periodically when they grew too mouldy, infested, or flattened. In garrisons, stewards were tasked with ensuring the straw was replenished, though fresh straw didn't mean fragrant meadow hay. Often it was whatever dry material could be hauled in bulk, already dusty and brittle. The quirky twist? Some castles reused old straw for animals once the bedding grew too foul for humans. Imagine waking to find a chicken pecking through your discarded mattress, or the stable master hauling your old bedding to line a horse's stall. Recycling existed long before modern eco-friendly slogans, though it wasn't motivated by saving the planet so much as saving every last scrap of usable material. And here's where scholars still puzzle. Did soldiers actually sleep directly on straw sacks, or did they spread loose straw across the floor like a communal carpet? Some accounts hint at pallet beds lined neatly, others at simple heaps where men collapsed shoulder to shoulder. The archaeological record is vague. Organic materials rarely survive centuries underground. What remains are impressions in soil layers, faint traces of reed or oat straw suggesting someone once rested there. You shift again, feeling how the stalks jab against your ribs, then rustle down, leaving a faint, earthy scent in the air. It is not unpleasant, grassy, dry, almost like a barn, but it mingles with sweat, smoke, and damp wool, producing a cocktail of smells that make you long for a window. Unfortunately, those narrow slits high in the wall are stuffed with wooden shutters to keep the wind out, so the air grows thick instead. Your ears catch the sounds of the bedding itself alive with movement. Fleas thrive here, jumping between soldier and soldier. The straw sacks offer perfect nesting for vermin, which gnaw, bite, and scurry while you're trying to drift off. You scratch absent-mindedly at your arm, cursing the invisible creatures, but realize there's no escape, they're part of the nightly routine. Some soldiers even joked about their bed companions, as if fleas were comrades keeping them awake through the long cold. Still, exhaustion always wins. You let yourself sink, despite the uneven lumps beneath you, and begin to understand why men tolerated such crude bedding. A layer of straw might be lumpy, itchy, and smelly, but it insulated better than bare boards or icy stone. As your body presses into the stalks, a thin pocket of trapped heat builds up, just enough to stop your bones from aching. The mattress settles around you, not soft in the way you'd expect, but yielding just enough to cradle your weight. You picture dozens of men lined up like this in the great hall. The fires glow dim at the far end. Each man turns, sighs, scratches, and the chorus of straw rustling becomes a kind of background music. The sound never stops, but it blends into a rhythm that lulls you towards sleep. The straw whispers beneath every shifting body, like dry leaves stirred by a faint autumn wind. And as you lie here, you realize something simple. Survival didn't depend on luxury. It depended on making do. For soldiers, the straw bed wasn't a comfort. It was a shield against the hard, frozen ground of a castle floor. Tonight, that shield scratches and pricks, but it also saves you. Your eyes begin to close. But before you drift too far, you feel a body press close against yours, heavy with shared fatigue. Straw might keep you off the stone, but true warmth will come from the man beside you. And that is where the night carries you next. You barely notice at first when another soldier shifts closer, his shoulder brushing yours, his breath mixing with the smoky air. In a world where personal space was a luxury, warmth meant survival. and the human body was the most reliable furnace available. Soldiers learned quickly that if you wanted to wake up alive, you didn't spread out, you huddled in. A mainstream historical fact is that communal sleeping arrangements were not only common in castles but deliberately encouraged. Men-at-arms, squires, and lower-ranking retainers often lay in long rows on pallets or directly on the floor, pressed against one another. Chroniclers describe entire garrisons bedding down in a single hall, the heat of dozens of bodies slowly raising the temperature from freezing to merely frigid. Privacy simply wasn't part of the equation. The quirky part of this arrangement? Medieval people sometimes gave affectionate nicknames to the practice of sharing warmth. In Northern Europe, records mention the phrase, warming by the other's flank, a phrase that almost sounds poetic until you realize it meant sweaty. Armored men trying not to freeze by clinging together like spoons in a human chain. There are even accounts of soldiers jokingly fighting for a spot in the middle, where warmth was best, rather than being stuck on the icy outer edge. Yet historians still debate how universal this practice was. Some argue that cultural norms about modesty might have prevented close contact, especially in southern Europe, where winters were milder. Others believe necessity outweighed embarrassment everywhere, pointing out that even monks in strict monastic orders often slept side by side under shared coverings. The truth is murky. Surviving documents rarely describe the exact sleeping positions of common soldiers. What is clear, however, is that when the wind rattled through castle arrow slits, nobody refused a little borrowed heat. You feel it now, the press of another man's cloak draped partly across your legs, the faint weight of his arm brushing yours. It isn't friendship. It isn't intimacy. It's a survival pact written in silence. The combined warmth of 2, then 3, then 10 bodies begins to soften the cold. The smell, of course, grows worse. Unwashed wool, stale ale, and sweat pooling together in a pungent fog, but you breathe it in anyway, because it's the cost of comfort. The sounds of the hall transform as the night deepens. Instead of the echoing emptiness you noticed before, the chamber fills with the slow chorus of human sleep. Snores rumble like distant thunder, coughs punctuate the darkness, and the shifting of limbs keeps the straw alive with crackles. The warmth builds in waves, rising and falling as men turn over or tug at cloaks. You realize something subtle. The closeness also carried emotional weight. Sleeping side by side reinforced bonds of trust and camaraderie. The man pressed against you might be the same one who shielded you in battle tomorrow, the same one who shared his ration of bread when the kitchens ran dry. The act of huddling together blurred the lines between necessity and solidarity. At the edge of the room, a poor soul lies alone, having lost his spot in the cluster. He shifts restlessly, tugging his cloak tighter, but the cold gnaws at him in a way you've managed to avoid. You understand why the middle positions were coveted, why soldiers whispered complaints about being stuck on the drafty edge of the bedding line. Your eyes flutter closed, lulled by the steady rhythm of breath all around you. You feel cocooned not by walls or blankets, but by the living presence of others, each man giving off just enough heat to keep the group alive. You wonder briefly, how many nights across centuries were survived this way, not through stone or steel, but through the simple act of sharing warmth. And as your body relaxes into this strange companionship, another presence slips into your imagination. It's not just men who huddled for heat. Sometimes, four-legged companions shared the bedding too. You hear the faint pad of paws across the hall, a dog settling at someone's feet, and you realize the night has more allies than you thought. The scratch of claws on the floor draws your attention. In the half-dark, a dog noses its way between the rows of sleeping men, tail wagging lazily as it searches for a place to curl up. You feel the sudden press of warmth at your feet when the animal finally circles twice and settles, sighing with the same exhaustion you carry in your bones. In medieval castles, animals were not just companions, they were part of the heating system. A mainstream historical fact is that dogs, cats, and sometimes even livestock were often brought indoors during winter nights. Cats served a double role: pest control and a small source of warmth when they curled into soldiers' laps. Dogs guarded against intruders and gave comfort while radiating body heat. In especially cold stables or halls, soldiers allowed horses to remain close, their massive bodies releasing enough warmth to raise the temperature of the room. Castles were living ecosystems, where human and animal cohabitation blurred for survival's sake. The quirky part? Some medieval accounts mention soldiers joking that the warmest beds belonged to the dogs. In certain households, the expression, a three-dog night, referred to needing not one, not two, but three hounds to sleep beside you in order to ward off the cold. It was more than a figure of speech, it was lived reality in drafty strongholds. Imagine the jumble of limbs, tails, and cloaks at the foot of a soldier's straw bed, as much fur as fabric keeping the frost at bay. But scholars still argue over how common this practice was in elite castles. Was animal companionship mainly for ordinary soldiers in the barracks? Or did nobles too keep dogs at their bedsides for warmth? Paintings and manuscripts show lapdogs nestled with ladies and hunting hounds stretched on noble chamber floors, but written accounts are often silent on whether soldiers regularly shared their bedding with animals. Archaeological digs, however, have revealed bones of dogs and cats within castle walls, suggesting these companions were far from rare. The smell, though, was another matter. You wrinkle your nose as the dog at your feet shifts, carrying with it the odor of wet fur, mingling with smoke, sweat, and straw. It is pungent, earthy, undeniably animal. Yet the warmth seeping into your toes makes you forgive the stench. You feel the slow rhythm of the dog's breathing, hear the faint thump of its tail in a dream, and realize it provides a kind of comfort beyond heat. The night feels less hostile with a living creature pressed against you. Elsewhere in the hall, a cat leaps lightly onto a man's chest, kneading its claws into his cloak before curling up with a purr. He grumbles, half asleep, but does not shove it away. The purring blends into the soundscape of the hall, snores, coughs, the creak of timbers, and the occasional pop of a dying ember. In the stables, horses shift in their stalls, snorting, the warmth of their bulk filling the air with steam that rises toward the rafters. You notice how the presence of animals shifts the atmosphere. It isn't just survival, it's companionship. The dog at your feet might be the same one that barked fiercely at strangers at the gate earlier in the day. The cat, keeping the vermin at bay, ensures your bread isn't nibbled away before you wake. Every creature plays its part in the delicate balance of castle life. You tuck your feet closer to the dog, appreciating the steady warmth radiating through fur and flesh. The cold stone walls still loom, the wind still howls faintly outside, but between men and beasts, the castle has created its own strange ecosystem of survival. Without them, nights like this might break you. With them, you find just enough comfort to drift further into sleep. And as the hall quiets, your gaze catches the faint shimmer of firelight at the far end. Flickering flames dance against the walls, fighting back shadows and giving the illusion of warmth that stretches farther than it truly does. Your eyes follow the glow, and your mind drifts toward the promise of the hearth. The glow at the far end of the hall beckons you, like the last beacon in a sea of shadows. You rise slowly from your bed of straw, careful not to disturb the dog curled at your feet, and shuffle toward the promise of heat. Each step echoes against stone, and the air feels marginally less cruel as you near the hearth. Flickering light paints the rough walls orange, highlighting every crack in the mortar, every dent in the wooden beams above. This is the castle's fragile heart against winter's breath, the fire. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval castles relied heavily on open hearths and portable braziers for warmth, particularly in the Great Hall. These were not tidy little fireplaces neatly tucked into walls. In early castles, the hearth was often an open fire in the center of the room, with smoke drifting upward to escape through a louver or hole in the roof. Later innovations did add chimneys and wall fireplaces, but even then, most soldiers never had the luxury of a private one. Instead, a single blaze attempted to heat a cavernous space, its warmth thinning quickly as it reached the farthest corners. You stand near the blaze now, letting the sting of cold in your cheeks give way to a sudden flush of heat. Sparks leap upward with a crack, carrying the scent of burning oak and resin. The fire is smoky, as green wood was often burned out of necessity, leaving your eyes watering and your throat scratchy. You cough, joining the chorus of others gathered around, and blink at the haze that clouds the hall's beams. And here comes the quirky detail. Fire wasn't always placed inside the hall at all. Chronicles describe men dragging iron braziers, shallow pots of glowing coals from chamber to chamber, like primitive space heaters. Imagine a soldier staggering through the corridor with one of these glowing buckets, nearly dropping it as hot embers scatter across the floor. Fires were life-saving, yes, but they were also constant hazards. Castle records contain countless orders about chimney sweeping, fire watching, and even rules forbidding soldiers to fall asleep too near the flames. More than one stronghold went up in smoke, not from siege, but from carelessness. You feel it yourself, the tension between comfort and danger. As your hands thaw in the fire's glow, you notice how close your wool sleeve is to the flame and how quickly it might catch. One wrong move, one drunken stumble, and the castle could face catastrophe. Soldiers, of course, knew this. Yet on bitter nights they edged closer anyway, weighing the risk of fire against the certainty of frostbite. Historians still disagree on how effective these fires actually were at warming entire halls. Some argue that the sheer volume of a stone chamber made it impossible to raise the temperature significantly, leaving soldiers warm only within a few feet of the blaze. Others point to accounts of great feasts, where roaring fires supposedly banished the cold entirely, suggesting that with enough fuel and enough bodies gathered, the warmth spread further than skeptics allow. Archaeological evidence offers hints, charred roof beams, soot-stained stones, but little clarity. The debate continues, a reminder of how much remains uncertain about everyday comfort in the Middle Ages. You edge closer to the hearth until the heat prickles your shins, almost painfully so, while your back still feels the icy breath of the hall. The contrast is sharp, like standing between two worlds, fire and frost, survival and surrender. The soldiers around you jostle for position, each one desperate for a spot close enough to feel relief. They stretch their hands, rub their faces. Some even press cloaks against the flames to capture warmth before rushing back to their bedding. The ritual repeats nightly, an endless cycle of thawing, retreating, and freezing again. Your senses sharpen. The crackle of wood, the hiss of sap bursting, the sudden pop of an ember leaping outward, all of it becomes part of the castle's lullaby. The air is thick with smoke, your hair and clothes quickly absorbing its scent until you carry it with you for days. Your eyes sting, but the glow is mesmerizing. You stare into the flames, seeing shapes and stories flicker in the dancing tongues of fire. Perhaps soldiers of old did the same, finding brief escape from their hardships in the hypnotic blaze. The fire offers more than warmth. It is a gathering place, a source of companionship in the endless dark. Men cluster here not only to thaw their hands but to share stories, laugh at crude jokes, or grumble about their commanders. You listen as two soldiers bicker about whose turn it is to guard the wall, their voices rising and falling with the crackling wood. Another hums a tune, soft and half forgotten, carried along by the smoke into the rafters. The fire binds them together, just as much as shared hardship does. Your mind drifts to the logistics behind this warmth. The fire doesn't burn by accident. Somewhere outside, in the bitter night, men haul wood from stacks, splitting logs, feeding the blaze with steady hands. Entire castle economies revolved around fuel. Foresters, woodcutters, and haulers ensured that garrisons had enough to last the season. Records from large castles like Windsor detail enormous quantities of firewood consumed each winter. Without constant supply, the flames you now bask in would gutter out, leaving only darkness and frost. The quirky downside was that firewood often ran short. During sieges, for instance, castles sometimes rationed fire just as strictly as food. Soldiers had to choose between freezing in silence or risking smoke betraying their presence to the enemy outside. Chronicles describe desperate measures, burning broken furniture, dismantling old carts, even using dried dung to keep fires alive. You wrinkle your nose at the thought of the acrid smoke filling these already stifling halls. And still, historians puzzle over one last question. Did every soldier have equal access to the hearth's warmth? Some suggest that proximity to the fire reflected rank, with commanders and favoured men securing the best spots, while others shivered at the edges. Others argue that in the barracks, survival trumped hierarchy. Whoever arrived first claimed the heat. The truth may have varied, but the tension is easy to imagine as you feel the press of shoulders around you, each man unwilling to yield his place. The heat finally seeps into your bones, and you savour the brief relief. Your toes stop aching, your fingers loosen, your breath no longer feels like misting ice. Yet you know the moment you step away, the chill will return. The fire is not a solution, only a reprieve. You watch as one soldier reluctantly pulls back, hurrying to his straw bed while clutching at the cloak he had pressed to the flames, hoping it will hold the warmth a little longer. You follow him with your eyes, and in that simple act you understand how medieval nights unfolded in cycles. Approach the fire, absorb what heat you can, retreat to the bedding, and repeat as needed until dawn. Comfort never lasted, only survived in moments stolen from the cold. You take one last look at the flames, the heart of this stone fortress, the fragile line between warmth and winter's bite. Then you step back, ready to face the chill again. Around you, soldiers pull curtains of heavy cloth to trap pockets of heat, creating little alcoves within the hall's vast space. You notice how these makeshift rooms within rooms offer a strange sense of privacy and comfort, and your curiosity pulls you toward one. The fire fades behind you, its glow still warm in your memory, as you prepare to slip behind a curtain and discover the castle's attempt to carve warmth out of stone. You tug aside a heavy swath of fabric and step quietly into a world within a world. The curtain falls behind you, and suddenly the drafty hall feels distant, muffled, almost as though you have slipped into a private cocoon. The space is no larger than a small booth, made by draping thick cloth from wooden beams or hooks hammered into stone. Yet inside, the air is noticeably warmer, your own breath caught and held by the walls of woven wool. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval castles often employed curtains, hangings, or even entire wooden screens to create alcoves. These weren't just for privacy, but were practical solutions to the constant cold. Nobles draped beds with elaborate canopies and heavy hangings, while soldiers and servants made do with rough wool or linen stretched across poles. By reducing the open space, they trapped body heat, turning icy chambers into more bearable pockets of warmth. Surviving tapestries and accounts confirm that these cloth partitions were far more than decoration, they were insulation. The quirky detail here is how creative people became with materials. In poorer castles or during campaigns, soldiers sometimes used cloaks or even spare shields as makeshift walls. Imagine draping a cloak across two lances stuck into the ground, crawling beneath it as though you had invented a personal tent indoors. Chronicles hint at soldiers hanging up spare horse blankets to partition space. It wasn't glamorous, but even the smallest barrier against the draft could mean the difference between restful sleep and waking with teeth chattering. Still, historians disagree on how widespread these alcove arrangements were among ordinary soldiers. Some argue that cloth hangings were expensive and mostly reserved for noble chambers or chapels. Others point out that castle inventories often list vast quantities of plain woolen cloth, suggesting its use was more democratic. Archaeologists examining castle walls have even found faint impressions of nails and hooks at heights consistent with curtain rods, implying that makeshift alcoves existed in multiple halls. Whether every soldier enjoyed them or only the lucky few, the principle of creating warm rooms within cold castles clearly shaped the medieval night. You run your fingers along the cloth surrounding you. It is rough, scratchy wool, dyed a muted brown. Your hand comes away faintly dusty, carrying the smell of smoke and lanolin. Yet you can already feel the difference. The stone chill no longer presses in from every side. The air is not warm, never warm, but it is less cruel, softened by the stillness. Your ears catch only muted echoes from the hall beyond. Snores, coughs, and the distant crackle of the fire filtered through the curtain like sounds underwater. You crouch, settle down onto the straw within, and let the curtain fall fully closed. The dimness feels safer, more private, even though half a dozen men are doing the same in alcoves nearby. You realize that in a world where privacy was rare, such spaces were precious. Here you might whisper a prayer without interruption, share a secret with a bunkmate, or simply close your eyes and imagine solitude. The curtain traps heat surprisingly well. You sense it after a few minutes. Your body's warmth clings to you, pooling in the narrow space. The dog that followed you inside circles once before, curling at your side, adding its own furnace-like contribution. The curtain sways gently when the draft outside presses against it, but the fabric holds, and the air inside remains stable. It's as though you've built a pocket of survival in the middle of a frozen fortress. The smell is thicker here, wool, sweat, smoke, and straw compressed together, but you accept it. In fact, the mingling odors feel oddly comforting, as though proof that others before you survived the same hardships. You stroke the dog's fur, listening to its steady breathing, and allow yourself to imagine that, for a few hours, the castle walls have been tamed. You think about how even nobles employed this same principle, though in richer form. Their four-poster beds were more than status symbols. The thick curtains wrapped around them transformed the bed into a heated capsule. Contemporary reports described nobles closing their bed curtains tightly at night, creating an almost tent-like chamber warmed by body heat, candles, or even bed warmers filled with coals. The concept was the same, whether noble or soldier. Shrink the space, trap the warmth, survive the cold. And here's another oddity worth savoring. Medieval people sometimes left religious or decorative images embroidered into their hangings, not just for beauty, but for spiritual comfort during the long, dark hours. In monasteries, for example, curtains might depict saints or biblical scenes, reminders that protection came not just from wool but from faith. Soldiers, meanwhile, might pin tokens, charms, or scraps of coloured cloth from home to their makeshift hangings. These little decorations gave identity to what otherwise would have been plain, scratchy barriers. Historians continue to debate how effective these alcoves truly were. Some experiments with replica hangings suggest they raised the temperature inside only slightly, perhaps by a degree or two, but enough to make survival tolerable. Others argue the psychological effect was as important as the physical one. Feeling enclosed, shielded from drafts and from watchful eyes, might have allowed soldiers to rest more deeply, even if the actual warmth was modest. The line between practical benefit and perceived comfort is blurry, but in survival, perception matters. You lean your head back against the cloth and close your eyes. The darkness inside is deeper than in the open hall, softened and still. The outside noises blur further, and you realize you are finally drifting towards something resembling sleep. But as your body relaxes, your thoughts linger on the cloak you set aside earlier, the same cloak that shielded you from rain on the march, that bore your lord's emblem in battle. In the stillness, you realize how often that same cloak doubled as a blanket, a final layer of warmth when everything else failed. The curtain alcove holds you steady, but your mind is already drifting toward the memory of pulling a cloak tight around your shoulders, wrapping it over your head as the night pressed in. That's where the story carries you next, into the folds of wool and the comfort of a soldier's most loyal garment. You ease out of the alcove for a moment, pulling the curtain aside and letting the draft remind you why that little cocoon mattered. The chill wraps around you like a wet cloak, and the irony isn't lost because a cloak really was the medieval soldier's blanket, shield, and sleeping bag all at once. When your bed was nothing but straw and your chamber full of cold air, that rectangle of wool became your dearest possession. A mainstream historical fact is that soldiers of the Middle Ages were rarely issued special bedding. Cloaks were multi-purpose, worn on patrol, draped over armor, and then pulled tight at night as the only cover available. Cloaks were often made of thick fulled wool, sometimes with hoods, sometimes lined with fur for the wealthy. On campaign, knights and men-at-arms carried them rolled behind saddles. In castles, a cloak doubled as a night blanket, often pulled right over the head to trap every breath of heat. The quirky part is that cloaks weren't just coverings, they became makeshift tents. Chronicles mention soldiers pinning cloaks between spears or leaning them against shields, crawling under them to make little shelters. One late medieval account describes archers laughing at a companion whose cloak had caught rain and frozen stiff, leaving him to crack it across his knees before wrapping it back around himself. It sounds ridiculous, but to those men it was normal. Cloaks were armor against the elements, sometimes more important than the steel on their backs. Yet historians still argue about the quality of these cloaks. Did every soldier have access to heavy, water-resistant wool, or were cheaper, thinner garments more common? Some suggest that only knights could afford fine-lined cloaks, while common soldiers relied on coarser, thinner wool that lost heat quickly when wet. Others counter with evidence from surviving wills and inventories, which often mention cloaks among the possessions of even modest men-at-arms, hinting that they were considered essentials rather than luxuries. The debate lingers, because cloth decays, leaving archaeologists with fragments and guesses rather than certainty. You draw the cloak tighter around your body now, imagining how its weight presses against you. It smells faintly of smoke from the hearth, mingled with damp earth and sweat. It scratches at your cheek as you pull it over your head, blocking out the drafts. Inside, the sound of the hall dulls, muffled into something distant. You breathe into the wool, your own breath warming the air pocket until your face grows flushed. It isn't comfortable, exactly, but it is survival. The sensation is oddly familiar, even to a modern listener. Think of camping with a single sleeping bag, or curling beneath a heavy quilt in a drafty cabin. Now imagine that quilt is your only shield from winter, day after day, night after night. That's how a soldier lived. Around you, other men do the same. One soldier pulls his cloak over his boots, tucking it under his legs to keep out the drafts. Another uses his as a pillow, bunching it beneath his head, while relying on body heat from his neighbor to keep him warm. A third wraps it so tightly that he resembles a cocoon, snoring into the folds while flecks of frost cling to the edge of the fabric. The cloak also carried symbolic weight. Many bore the colours or emblem of a lord. So at night, men literally wrapped themselves in their allegiance. Imagine drifting to sleep with your lord's crest stretched across your chest. The fabric a reminder of duty, even in your most vulnerable moments. For some, the cloak wasn't just warmth, it was identity. And then there's the less glamorous detail. Lice. Cloaks, worn constantly and rarely washed, became infested quickly. Soldiers complained of scratching through the night, fleas and lice crawling in the seams. You shift uncomfortably at the thought, tugging your cloak tighter anyway, because the choice was simple: itch or freeze. Most chose to itch. The cloak also absorbed the smells of daily life: cooked meat, horse sweat, campfire smoke. Wrapped in it, you breathe in the entire story of the day. That pungent mix becomes almost comforting, a reminder of battles fought, meals shared, and nights survived. When cloaks grew too foul, men beat them with sticks or hung them in smoke to drive out pests. Washing was rare, because wet wool could take days to dry, leaving a man more vulnerable to cold. Historians note one more point of debate. Were cloaks ever lined with fur for common soldiers, or was that a privilege of nobles? Surviving accounts suggest that fur linings were expensive and mostly reserved for wealthy households. Yet some argue that in the coldest climates, cheaper furs, rabbit, squirrel, even cat may have been stitched into soldiers' cloaks. It's a detail that makes modern readers shudder, but survival often trumped sentiment. You close your eyes inside your wool cocoon, feeling how the fabric muffles sound and traps warmth. You hear only your own breathing, steady and rhythmic. For a few moments, it almost feels private, safe. The stone walls fade, the draft weakens, and you might just drift into real sleep. But then, from somewhere in the hall, comes the unmistakable sound of a jug being set down, the slosh of liquid pouring into a cup. The smell of ale wafts faintly across the hall, carried on laughter and murmured voices. A soldier gulps, wipes his mouth with the back of his hand, and sighs with satisfaction. The drink promises a different kind of warmth, one that burns from within. You stir beneath your cloak, listening as mugs clink and the firelight flickers on their faces. You realize that, in the absence of thick blankets or central heating, sometimes the surest way to fight the cold was to drink it away. And so, as you curl deeper into your cloak, your thoughts drift toward the role of ale, wine, and other night draughts in helping soldiers forget the bite of the medieval night. The faint slosh of liquid in a jug becomes irresistible, pulling your senses out of the woolen cocoon and toward the little circle of men huddled near the fire. One of them tips back a wooden cup, swallowing with a satisfied grunt before passing it along. Another warms his hands over the vessel itself, letting the steam curl upward into the smoky hall. In the world of medieval castles, ale was not just a drink. At night it was a blanket for the belly, a liquid fire to carry you past the cold stone walls. A mainstream historical fact is that ale was a staple of the medieval diet. It wasn't the frothy pub drink you picture today, but a lightly fermented, low-alcohol beverage consumed daily by peasants and nobles alike. Soldiers drank it as part of their rations, often brewed right within castle walls by dedicated alewives or in small brewhouses. At night, a cup of warm ale or sometimes mulled wine when supplies allowed, offered not only comfort but calories and hydration. Water in cisterns could stagnate, but ale, boiled during brewing, was safer. The quirky twist is that soldiers sometimes spiced their drinks with herbs like rosemary, sage, or even pepper, believing these additions helped heat the body from within. One account describes guards on a frosty night mixing hot stones into their mugs of ale to raise the temperature, gulping quickly before it cooled again. Imagine the awkward comedy of men fishing half-burnt stones out of their cups while trying to look dignified. Medieval medicine blurred into daily practice, and drinking herbs or spices was thought to balance the humours and drive away chill. But here lies a point of scholarly debate. Did alcohol actually help them sleep warmer, or was it only an illusion? Modern science tells us that alcohol dilates blood vessels, creating a brief sensation of warmth, but ultimately lowering core temperature. Some historians argue that soldiers unknowingly sabotaged their own bodies by drinking heavily before bed. Others counter that the psychological comfort of a warm belly and a drowsy head outweighed the physical drawback. After all, in a freezing castle with no insulation, a little illusion might be all you had. You watch the men pass around their mugs, their faces glowing faintly in the firelight. The smell of ale mixes with smoke and straw, yeasty and sour, yet oddly inviting. One soldier sighs deeply, setting down his empty cup with the relief of a man who knows he'll at least drift into a stupor. Another hums a tune, tapping his fingers on the wooden rim, his voice slurring into the shadows. Alcohol softened the edges of hardship, dulled the awareness of cold, and made the long nights shorter. The dog at your feet stirs, perhaps smelling the malt. A soldier reaches down absent-mindedly and tips a drop toward the floor, laughing as the dog laps it up. You imagine the mutt swaying later, more from warmth of belly than body heat. Even animals weren't immune to the castle's rituals. You take a sip in your imagination, letting the warmth coat your throat. It isn't sweet, more bitter, earthy, sometimes sour if the brew had sat too long, but it spreads a haze through your chest, loosening your muscles. The tension in your shoulders eases, your heartbeat slows, and for the first time tonight you feel drowsiness carry you close to sleep. The ale is a lullaby, crude but effective. The hall hums with this strange camaraderie. Men laugh louder now, though the jokes are crude and short. One stumbles slightly as he heads back to his straw pallet, collapsing in a heap with cloak and boots still on. Another curls right where he sits, head resting on the rim of his empty mug. The firelight dances, the voices fade, and the ale does its work. You reflect on how central drinking culture was to medieval life. Feasts, fasts, celebrations, even ordinary nights all circled around ale or wine. In the castle barracks, ale was not luxury, it was ration. Records show garrisons requesting gallons daily, not for merriment, but because liquid bread was part of survival. Warmed slightly, it carried the illusion of a hearth into the body. Soldiers without ale often complained bitterly. Those with it endured. And yet, historians still wonder how much drunkenness interfered with duty. Did ale actually make soldiers worse at guarding their posts? Some sources describe sleepy, stumbling sentries punished for drinking too much. Others argue that low-alcohol ale rarely produced true intoxication, serving more as nutrition than danger. The line remains blurred, just like the torchlit haze in which you sit now. You close your eyes, swaying with the rhythm of the hall. Your belly feels full, your body warm, your mind softening into a haze. For a moment, the icy stone fortress seems far less menacing. But then, a sudden clatter jolts you awake, the sound of boots pacing on the floor. A guard has risen, shoulders hunched, ready to walk his shift along the battlements. His task is the hardest, to face the night outside without fire, without company, and with no cloak thick enough to banish the biting wind. As you nestle back into your cloak, you can almost feel his footsteps echoing through the castle, his breath steaming in the night air. The ale may warm those inside, but for him, there is no such comfort. The guard's dilemma is the next story waiting beyond the flicker of the fire. The laughter fades, mugs are set down, and the hall sinks slowly into a chorus of snores. But you can still hear the sharp, steady rhythm of boots across the flagstones. Out on the battlements, the guard's footsteps sound like a heartbeat against the stone, echoing in the night air. Inside, men huddle close to fire and cloaks, their bellies warmed with ale. Outside, the sentry must stay awake, exposed, and utterly vulnerable to the cold. His body shivers against the relentless wind, while you turn on your straw bed and wonder what it feels like to endure such a shift. A mainstream historical fact is that guards were posted in shifts throughout the night on castle walls and gatehouses. It was not optional, it was the lifeblood of defense. A castle left unwatched might as well invite enemies through its doors. Rotations often lasted a few hours at a time, with men relieving each other so that no one froze too completely. But accounts from garrisons describe the misery of these duties, pacing endlessly to keep blood flowing, stamping feet, clapping hands, and pulling cloaks tightly around the body while the night dragged on. The quirky part is how some guards fought the monotony. Chronicles and anecdotes describe sentries singing softly to themselves, reciting prayers in rhythm with their steps, or even composing little rhymes to pass the hours. In one French garrison, a guard reportedly carried a pocketful of walnuts, cracking them one by one through the night to keep himself awake. Another tale tells of men walking in pairs, not for safety against enemies, but to nudge each other awake when eyelids grew heavy. You smile at the thought, medieval buddy systems against frostbite and boredom alike. Yet historians still argue over how effective these guards truly were in the dead of winter. Some suggest that half-frozen men could hardly have been alert enough to stop a surprise attack. Others counter that sheer necessity honed discipline, and that men who survived the coldest nights built reputations for endurance and loyalty. There are even debates about whether alcohol was allowed before duty. Did commanders forbid it to ensure alertness, or did they turn a blind eye, knowing that without a little warmth in the belly, no man could stand the watch? Surviving orders and punishments hint at both possibilities. You picture it clearly. A soldier wrapped in his wool cloak, hood pulled low, trudging the same 50 steps of wall again and again. The sky is a heavy grey-black, clouds hiding the stars, and the wind howls through arrow slits like a pipe organ. He grips his spear tighter, not as a weapon, but as a crutch to lean on when the cold weakens his legs. His breath puffs white with each exhale, quickly whisked away by the gale. Beneath his boots, Frost gathers in the cracks of stone. His eyes water, his nose runs, and he wipes it with a sleeve already stiff with ice. He stops for a moment to peer out into the darkness beyond the walls. Perhaps he imagines shapes moving, raiders, wolves, or simply shadows cast by the moon. The cold plays tricks on perception. Ears ring, teeth chatter, and even the faint creak of a tree branch might sound like an advancing army. Fear and frost mix together until every sound becomes suspicious. The smell of smoke from the hall below reaches him faintly, mingling with the sharp tang of frozen air. He envies the men curled up on straw, the warmth of dogs at their feet, the taste of ale still on their tongues. But he also knows that without him, they would sleep vulnerable. The irony of medieval life. One man shivered awake so that dozens could dream. You feel it yourself as you walk in his boots for a moment, pacing back and forth along the battlement. The stone is slick beneath your feet, icy patches catching your step. The parapet rises around you like jagged teeth, blocking some wind but channeling it straight into your face. Your fingers ache even under gloves, your joints stiffen, and you stamp your feet harder just to feel them. The cloak wrapped around you is heavy, but the wind sneaks through every gap. You bend your head, teeth clenched, and mutter a curse to no one in particular. Some guards improvised small comforts. They tucked hot stones inside their boots before going on watch, or smuggled out coals in little iron pots, hiding them in corners to warm numb fingers. Of course, rules usually forbade open flames on the battlements an enemy could spot the glow. But desperation breeds disobedience, and some commanders tolerated it if it meant their men survived the shift. Others enforced harsh punishments, leaving sentries to suffer rather than risk a slip in discipline. One quirky but practical trick was chewing garlic or onions before watch. Believed to heat the blood, the sharp taste jolted men awake, while the pungent smell clung to their breath all night. Imagine a castle guard reeking of onions, muttering prayers under his breath, hoping the warmth in his belly outweighed the mockery of his comrades later. Still, the scholarly debate lingers. How many guards actually stayed awake? Did exhaustion and cold overwhelm even the most disciplined? A handful of accounts accuse men of dozing off, caught and punished severely, sometimes with flogging or fines. Others suggest commanders built schedules carefully, allowing just short enough shifts that drowsiness couldn't overpower duty. With so few records, the truth likely lies somewhere in between. Some guards endured with grit, others failed, and the castle trusted to numbers more than perfection. As the night deepens, you imagine yourself trudging onward, your thoughts growing hazy. The wind roars in your ears, your legs ache, and time itself seems to freeze. Minutes feel like hours. You wonder whether the moon has moved at all, or if dawn will ever come. Your hand tightens around the spear, not for defense, but simply to remind you that you are awake, alive, still here. Finally, at the end of the shift, a fellow soldier appears, his own cloak pulled high, his face red with cold. You pass the duty to him without a word, shuffling back down the stairwell into the hall. The heat of the fire and the murmur of snores greet you like paradise. You collapse onto your straw, too exhausted even to remove your boots, and fall instantly asleep. But not every soldier was lucky enough to guard the walls or share warmth inside the great hall. Some nights, when the barracks were too crowded or the straw too foul, men sought refuge elsewhere in the haylofts above the stables, where the scent of animals mingled with the promise of insulation. And so, as you drift into sleep, your mind climbs upward, following the rustle of hay and the low snort of horses, toward another kind of bed waiting in the loft. You climb a narrow wooden ladder, the rungs creaking under your weight, until your head rises into a loft that smells of hay, manure, and animal heat. The air is thicker here, heavy with the warmth of living bodies below. Horses shift in their stalls, stamping hooves and blowing steam into the darkness, while chickens rustle in corners and a cat slinks silently between bales. Compared to the icy stone hall, the hayloft feels almost like a sanctuary, A mainstream historical fact is that hay and straw were common insulating materials in the medieval world, and soldiers sometimes slept in stables or barns precisely because of the warmth they offered. Records from manorial estates and castle accounts occasionally note soldiers quartered in stables during campaigns, or even lodging with their animals when overflow from barracks forced them elsewhere. The hayloft above a stable provided a double advantage: insulation from thick piles of hay and the steady, radiant heat of the horses below. The quirky side of this arrangement is that some men preferred the loft even when space was available in the hall. Chroniclers joke about soldiers claiming they slept with the horses because the beasts gave off more warmth than comrades. Horses generate a remarkable amount of heat, their bodies steaming even on freezing nights. Men curled above them could feel that heat rising, drifting into the hay, turning the loft into a crude but effective heated chamber. It was, in its way, medieval central heating powered by horseflesh. But historians still question how widespread this practice really was. Did stables regularly double as barracks? Or was it only in emergencies? Some argue that disease and hygiene concerns would have made commanders reluctant to lodge men with animals. Others counter that survival outweighed squeamishness, and when the cold bit deep, no one cared about the smell. Archaeological digs at some castles reveal bedding layers in outbuildings rather than halls, supporting the idea that haylofts were used for human sleep more often than records admit. You settle into the hay, feeling it prick against your skin. Unlike the straw pallets in the hall, this hay is loose, piled thickly, and it shifts beneath you like a restless mattress. You burrow deeper, creating a little nest, and the warmth seeps around you. The smell is sharp, sweet grass mixed with the musk of animals and the ammonia tang of urine, but it is oddly soothing, an earthy perfume that promises life in a world of stone. Your ears catch the sound of horses chewing methodically, their teeth grinding hay into pulp. The rhythm is steady, hypnotic, like a lullaby composed of animal hunger. Occasionally one snorts, shaking its head, sending dust swirling into the air. A chicken clucks sleepily. The cat leaps softly onto a beam, and the loft settles into a chorus of stable life. It is noisy compared to the muffled snores of the hall, but the warmth makes you forgive the disturbance. You shift, pulling your cloak around your shoulders, adding its scratchy wool to the hay's insulation. Your body sinks into the pile, surrounded on all sides by stalks that hold heat better than stone walls ever could. The loft feels alive, breathing with the animals below, every exhale of the horses rising to wrap you in their warmth. Of course, the drawbacks are clear. The hay is dusty, making your nose itch. Fleas and lice thrive here as much as in the barracks, joined by the occasional rat scurrying through the shadows. The risk of fire is constant. One careless spark could reduce the entire stable, and everyone in it, to ash. Some castle regulations specifically forbade open flames near the stables, which meant no lanterns, no braziers, nothing but darkness and animal heat to rely on. You try to imagine the courage it took to sleep in a black loft filled with hay, knowing one accident could spell doom. Yet, despite the risks, the loft offers something the hall cannot: silence from human company. The snoring chorus is replaced by the low sounds of animals, easier on the ears. Privacy, too, comes more readily if you burrow deeply enough into the hay. You can almost vanish. For a soldier exhausted by camaraderie and constant closeness, the solitude of a hay nest might be priceless. Your thoughts wander to the bonds formed between men and animals in such spaces. A horse might be more than a mount. It was warmth, livelihood, and companion. Some accounts even suggest men whispered prayers into their horses' ears, as if the beast could carry their secrets to heaven. Cats, meanwhile, curled close to keep vermin at bay, their purring steady as a hearth. Dogs padded about, slipping into the hay beside their masters, adding another layer of warmth to the living blanket. Still, scholars debate whether soldiers truly found these lofts more comfortable than halls. Some experiments with reconstructed stables show that temperatures in haylofts could rise several degrees above outside air, especially with horses present. Others argue the dampness of hay, combined with vermin and poor ventilation, would have made long-term sleep there unhealthy. Perhaps the truth lies in preference. Some soldiers tolerated discomfort for warmth, while others preferred the cold stone hall to the stifling musk of a stable. You bury deeper into your imagined nest, inhaling the grassy smell until it fills your lungs. The loft creaks softly with the weight of men shifting above and beasts moving below. The sense of enclosure is profound. Here you are not surrounded by cold stone but by living matter, fragile yet warm. It feels temporary, makeshift, but somehow more human than the echoing hall. Your eyelids grow heavy as the horses chew and stamp, their breath rising like invisible prayers. The hay prickles against your cheek. Your cloak presses close, and the heat settles over you like a blessing. Perhaps, you think, this is the best sleep you can hope for in a castle night, not noble comfort, not soldierly camaraderie, but the shared warmth of beasts and the earth's own harvest. Yet as you drift, another sound intrudes, the metallic scrape of iron, the clink of coal. Somewhere in the castle, soldiers drag portable braziers into chambers, their glow promising another kind of warmth, more dangerous, but more immediate. Your mind stirs toward them, curious about these little pots of fire that walked with men through the night. A scrape echoes through the corridor below, followed by the faint metallic clink of iron. You peer down from your hayloft perch, and there it is, a brazier glowing red in the hands of a soldier staggering under its weight. The light spills onto the floor in quivering patterns, casting shadows that writhe like spirits along the stone. He sets it down, sighs in relief, and stretches his numb hands above the coals. The fire hisses faintly as a damp log smoulders on the embers. Portable heat, yes, but also a constant reminder that survival and danger walked hand in hand. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval castles employed braziers, portable metal containers filled with coals as mobile heat sources. They were usually made of iron or bronze, standing on legs or hung from chains. Castle inventories list them alongside tongs, shovels, and firewood, marking them as everyday tools of survival. They allowed warmth to follow where needed, into guardrooms, chapels, kitchens, or even bedrooms. Unlike the Great Hall's hearth, which burned visibly and centrally, braziers spread their glow more discreetly, warming small groups of soldiers through the night. The quirky side of braziers lies in the improvisation. Chronicles mention men filling cooking pots with coals, carrying them between chambers in a desperate attempt to avoid the cold. Imagine a soldier clutching a dented kettle glowing from within, muttering prayers that it doesn't spill hot embers onto his cloak. There are even tales of men using helmet shells as makeshift braziers, their steel armor doubling as a firepot. Whether those stories are exaggerations or half-remembered jokes, they reflect the ingenuity born of freezing nights. Historians still debate how safe or unsafe these braziers really were. On one hand, they provided essential heat in drafty castles, where fires couldn't be built into every room. On the other, they were notorious fire hazards. Stone doesn't burn, but wooden beams, rush mats, and straw bedding certainly do. Many castle fire regulations explicitly warned against braziers near sleeping quarters. Archaeological evidence of charred layers in certain castles may even point to fires started this way. Scholars disagree whether the convenience outweighed the risk, or whether chroniclers exaggerated dangers to lecture about carelessness. The truth probably lies somewhere between necessity and recklessness. You crouch near the brazier, feeling its heat lick your hands. The warmth is sharper than the hearth, more focused, almost biting. It radiates outward in waves, searing your palms when you lean too close and leaving your back still chilled. The sensation is addictive. You inch closer, then pull away, repeating the dance like every soldier before you. The air smells metallic, tinged with ash and the faint, acrid scent of burning charcoal. A cough echoes from across the room. Too much smoke in a closed space, and lungs suffer even as skin warms. The brazier transforms the space around it. A handful of men gather close, huddling around the glow, their faces lit red from below like eerie masks. One holds his boots over the coals, steam rising as the leather dries. Another drops a piece of bread onto the rim, toasting it awkwardly before snatching it back, half burnt but still edible. Laughter ripples among them, a brief moment of levity carved from the cold night. The brazier is not just heat, it's company, a miniature hearth for those unable to reach the great fire. Your ears catch the hiss of a log crumbling to ash. Sparks dance upward, threatening to leap onto the straw at your feet. You instinctively stamp at one, heart quickening as you realize how close disaster lurks. Fire promises life, yet takes it as swiftly as it gives. Perhaps that was why medieval people lived in such tension with it, revering it, fearing it, regulating it to the last ember. The dog that had curled at your feet before sidles closer now, drawn by the warmth. It circles once, then settles with its nose nearly touching the iron rim. A soldier nudges it back with a boot, muttering about singed fur, but the mutt simply flops down stubbornly, eyes half closed. Even beasts knew the brazier's worth. You imagine the logistics again, how many braziers a castle might require, how many men it took to tend them. Stewards organized coals, recorded their distribution, and ensured supplies of wood or charcoal reached every hall. It wasn't as simple as lighting a fire. It was a system, a constant movement of heat around a fortress too vast to warm in its entirety. Castles consumed fuel like armies consumed bread, and without it, even their stone might as well have been a tomb. Some soldiers swore by carrying small coals in clay pots beneath their bedding, a kind of primitive bed warmer. Risky, yes, but desperation bred courage. Others claimed to heat stones in the brazier, wrapping them in cloth and tucking them into cloaks or boots. These glowing tokens offered warmth for hours, until their heat faded back into chill. You picture yourself holding one of those stones now, clutching it like a treasure, savoring every lingering degree. Still, scholars remain divided on whether these techniques were everyday practice or occasional measures. Was the brazier truly a nightly ritual in castles, or only reserved for extreme cold? Records don't answer clearly, leaving modern imagination to fill in the gaps. The brazier's glow dims as coals crumble into grey ash. One soldier stirs it with iron tongs, coaxing a last flare of red before resigning himself to its death. The men sigh, stand slowly, and drift back to their straw. Darkness creeps in again, the cold immediately reclaiming the room. The dog lifts its head, yawns, and trots back toward the hall's warmer crowd. You linger a moment longer, staring into the fading embers. Their last heat clings to your skin, quickly stolen by the night air. You pull your cloak around your shoulders, remembering that tomorrow the steward will refill the brazier, and the cycle will repeat. Tonight, though, its warmth is gone, and you must rely on your own body and clothes to carry you through. Your hand brushes against the edge of a linen shift folded near your bedding. You realize that beneath the wool cloaks and rough straw, soldiers also wore nightshirts and hoods, simple garments that softened the transition from day to night. Some scoffed at them, others swore by them. You tug the cloth closer, wondering how such humble linen might feel against frozen skin. And so your thoughts drift naturally from the glowing brazier to the quieter comfort of medieval nightclothes, the linen shifts and hoods that bridged the gap between day's armor and night's chill. You let the last heat of the brazier fade from your skin, then reach down to the folded fabric beside you. It is light in your hands. Not the coarse scratch of wool, but something smoother, softer linen. The shift, as it was called, was one of the few comforts that could make the difference between a miserable night and a tolerable one. Soldiers rarely had luxuries, but when they did, it was often something simple. A linen shirt to sleep in, perhaps paired with a wool hood pulled tight around the ears. A mainstream historical fact is that linen nightshirts and woolen hoods were widely used in the Middle Ages, not just by nobles but also by common soldiers when they could afford them. Linen was cooler in summer and warmer in winter than bearskin alone, and it wicked sweat away during sleep. The hood, meanwhile, functioned almost exactly like a medieval beanie or balaclava, trapping the heat that escaped most readily through the head. In fact, Manuscript illustrations show monks and laymen alike bundled in long shifts with hoods tied snugly beneath their chins, curled up like bundled infants against the draught. The quirky detail? Nightshirts often doubled as daywear under other garments, and soldiers sometimes never bothered to remove them. There are even humorous accounts of men startled awake by alarms rushing straight into battle still wearing their shifts, armor buckled over what was essentially underwear. One tale from a Burgundian garrison describes a soldier mocked by his fellows for charging into a drill like a ghost, pale linen fluttering beneath his mail. Yet, however ridiculous it looked, the garment did its job, keeping the body warm enough to function. Historians still debate just how common true nightclothes were for soldiers. Did every man sleep in a designated shift, or did most simply collapse in the same tunics they wore during the day? Some argue that linen shifts were too valuable to be soiled nightly and reserved mainly for wealthier households. Others point to inventories of even modest estates listing multiple shifts per person, suggesting that this most basic garment was ubiquitous. The surviving fragments are too few to settle the argument definitively, leaving us to weigh practicality against cost. You lift the imagined shift to your face and breathe in. It smells faintly of lye soap, though more often it would reek of smoke, sweat, or mildew. Linen, when freshly washed, carried a crisp scent, but in the castle barracks laundry was sporadic at best. More likely, the shift felt damp against the skin, carrying the cold of unheated washwater or the rank of many nights' wear. Still, compared to wool's itch, the fabric glided smoothly across your arms, softening the edge of discomfort. You slip it over your head in your imagination, the linen brushing your shoulders, settling heavily to your knees. The wool hood follows, pulled down until it frames your face in a warm cocoon. The ties dangle against your chest. The fabric muffles sound slightly, and you suddenly feel less exposed to the vastness of the hall. The garments may be simple, but they create a sense of enclosure, a private climate zone in an otherwise merciless environment. Around you, other men adjust their hoods, tugging them over noses and ears until only their eyes peek out. Some have patched garments, ragged at the hems, others boast shifts neatly mended by wives or camp followers. A few sleep bareheaded, stubborn or too poor for a hood, and they shiver visibly in the draught. The dog curls closer to one such man, as if sensing the need for extra warmth. The hood, though small, carried symbolic weight too. In some regions, soldiers were actually buried in their hoods, the garment considered almost an extension of the body. A hood offered anonymity, protection, and identity all at once. For a soldier lying in a hall of dozens, it might be the only garment that made him feel like himself. You adjust your hood, pull your shift close, and curl onto your side on the straw. The difference is immediate. Where bare wool or rough cloak scratched, the linen soothes. Where the cloak alone left gaps, the hood seals them. You imagine yourself sinking deeper into a warmth created not by roaring fires or braziers, but by layers carefully stacked. Linen next to skin, wool cloaks wrapped above, straw beneath, and finally the warmth of bodies near at hand. The sounds of the hall lull you further. Muffled snores, the occasional cough, the faint rustle of straw. Somewhere, a soldier mutters in his sleep, words lost to dreams. The dog sighs, stretching paws against your legs, and the warmth builds slowly in your cocoon. But then comes the downside. The chorus of snores swells, each one different in pitch and rhythm. A nasal whistle from one side, a guttural rumble from another, punctuated by the occasional loud snort that startles you awake. The comfort of nightshirts and hoods fades as you realize that sleeping in a communal hall meant not just warmth but noise. You roll onto your back, staring up into the dim rafters, and let the cacophony wash over you. It is both irritating and strangely reassuring, a reminder that you are not alone in this fortress, that dozens share the same struggles. The night stretches on, filled with sound and warmth in equal measure, and you drift slowly into a fitful sleep. Tomorrow, You'll remember the relief of linen against skin and wool across your head. But tonight, what you remember most is the sound of men breathing in unison, filling the hall with a symphony of survival. The night deepens, and the warmth of your hood and shift begins to fade against the growing awareness of a different discomfort: sound. The communal hall is no longer a place of chatter and firelight. It has become a great chorus of men lost in slumber. The noise is relentless. Some breathe softly, others wheeze with every exhale, and still others erupt in sudden snorts that jolt you back from the edge of sleep. If the cold was an enemy, then noise was its mocking companion. One well-documented reality of medieval barracks life is that soldiers rarely, if ever, slept alone. Entire garrisons bedded down in shared halls, packed shoulder to shoulder on pallets of straw, or directly on rush-covered floors. This was efficient for defense. An alarm could rouse the entire troop in moments, but it also meant that every cough, sneeze, and restless toss echoed into your own dreams. Records from castles such as Dover and Warwick note that barrack halls could hold dozens, sometimes hundreds, of men. Privacy was nearly non-existent, and sleep was a communal endeavor in every sense. Oddly enough, some medieval writers even joked about the cacophony. One chronicle from Burgundy quips that the soldiers sang 3 tunes at once, meaning 3 men snored at different pitches, producing a kind of unintended harmony. Another anecdote mentions men stuffing bits of wool or hay into their ears to block out the racket, though whether this was serious advice or a scribe's attempt at humor is impossible to tell. Imagine trying to drift off while the hall vibrated like a mismatched choir, each man competing to see who could rattle the rafters the loudest. Yet experts remain divided on how much this noise truly bothered medieval sleepers. Some argue that soldiers, accustomed to constant background sounds, animals, market squares, church bells, were simply less sensitive to it than modern ears. Others suggest that the fatigue of military life overwhelmed any annoyance, exhaustion dulled perception, and men could sleep through the loudest snoring if they were tired enough. Archaeological finds of earplugs made from wax and cloth hint that some individuals sought quiet even then, but the scale of their use remains uncertain. You lie back on your straw pallet, listening to the hall's strange music. To your left, a man breathes in a high-pitched whistle, his nose clearly blocked by the damp air. To your right, another rumbles like distant thunder, each inhale louder than the last. Somewhere farther off, a cough erupts, followed by the muttered curse of his neighbor. The layers of sound overlap, weaving together into something you cannot escape. At first it frustrates you, the unpredictability of the snorts and rumbles breaking the rhythm of your drifting mind. But gradually, the sound transforms into a kind of lullaby. It is not melodic, but it is human, the collective sound of men surviving another night. Each snore reminds you that bodies still breathe beside you, that you are not alone in the fortress's frozen belly. The smell of smoke clings to the air, mixing with sweat and damp wool. The fire has burned low, leaving only embers, but the snoring continues as though powered by its own fuel. You pull your cloak tighter, adjusting the hood, and realize that in a place where silence is rare, noise itself becomes a blanket. The sound fills the void, pushes back against the emptiness of night, and lulls you with its persistence. You picture the scene from above, rows of men stretched across the hall, each in his own cocoon of cloak and straw, yet all bound together by the rhythm of their bodies. The chorus rises and falls, uneven but constant, as if the castle itself breathes through its garrison. The dog by your feet sighs and joins in, a soft whimper adding to the nocturnal orchestra. Some soldiers even turned this inconvenience into camaraderie. Accounts from later centuries mention men teasing each other about their battle snores, joking that a comrade's noise could ward off spirits or frighten rats. Others claimed the snoring was proof of good health. Only the strong breathed loudly enough to shake the rafters. Whether genuine belief or gallows humor, it shows how men reframed irritations as signs of endurance. Of course, not everyone was amused. Sleeplessness plagued some soldiers, leaving them irritable and exhausted during the day. Chroniclers occasionally note grumblings about restless nights in company, particularly during sieges when tension was already high. Modern researchers continue to puzzle over how much poor sleep affected garrison effectiveness. Did constant noise lead to lower alertness? Or did medieval bodies simply adapt to the chaos? The evidence is too thin to decide, leaving only speculation shaped by scraps of narrative. You turn onto your side again, pressing your ear into the straw, trying to block the noise. The stalks rustle, a softer sound that briefly competes with the snores. Your eyelids grow heavy, lulled not by silence but by surrender. You cannot escape the chorus, so you join it. Your own breath deepens, your chest rises and falls, and soon your rhythm blends into the hall's vast symphony. And yet, while you sleep in relative warmth and company, you know that not every night in a castle was so forgiving. Sometimes garrisons found themselves forced to camp outside the walls during winter campaigns, bedding down in snow and mud with only canvas and earth to protect them. Compared to that misery, a noisy hall was luxury. So as your mind drifts further into sleep, the snores fade into the background, and your thoughts wander towards soldiers in the field, those who face the cold without walls, without fire, and often without hope. The harsh reality of winter campaigns beckons, reminding you that survival outside stone walls demanded even greater ingenuity. The stone walls dissolve in your half-dream, and suddenly you are outside the fortress, trudging across a frozen plain. The cold is no longer filtered by curtains or warmed by cloaks. It assaults you directly, carried on cutting winds that slice through every seam of your clothing. The ground beneath your boots crunches with ice, and the sky above is a pale, endless grey. In this world, there are no straw pallets or braziers to soften the night. Soldiers on campaign in winter had only the bare earth, a few scraps of canvas, and their own determination to see the dawn. It's firmly established in chronicles that medieval armies often campaigned through winter, despite the misery it caused. Commanders could not always choose the season of war. Sieges dragged on, marches stretched unexpectedly long, and armies needed to remain in position regardless of weather. Men built shelters out of whatever they had: canvas tents for the fortunate, crude lean, twos of wood and sod for others, and in some cases, nothing more than cloaks pulled tightly over curled-up bodies on the frozen ground. Archaeological traces of these camps reveal fire pits, trench lines, and even makeshift huts dug halfway into the soil for insulation. A curious little detail emerges in some records. Men sometimes carried small spades specifically to dig shallow pits, which they lined with straw, brush, or even their own cloaks. Crawling into these hollows offered a degree of protection from wind, a technique resembling the foxholes of later centuries. It was primitive, dirty, and damp, but better than lying exposed on open ground. One account from the campaigns of Edward I in Scotland describes soldiers burrowing into the earth, like badgers, covering themselves with branches to survive the bitter nights. Not everyone agrees on how sustainable these methods were. Modern scholars remain divided on whether medieval troops truly endured entire winters in field conditions, or if armies more often retreated into towns and castles once snow fell. Some evidence points to long, grueling winter sieges, like the famous case of Calais in 1346, where men certainly endured months of cold in rough shelters. Others argue that chroniclers may have exaggerated the hardships to highlight soldiers' heroism or commanders' cruelty. The truth is likely a mix. Some endured weeks in snow, while others found shelter whenever possible. You sink into the vision of one such camp. Canvas tents flapping like sails in the wind. The fire pits at the center burn low, for fuel is scarce. Men huddle close, their faces blackened with smoke, their hands stretched over embers that offer only the illusion of heat. Some chew stale bread, others sip at watered ale, and all of them curse the frost. Cloaks pulled tight, they lie shoulder to shoulder, using each other as living insulation. The ground beneath is hard and unyielding, and every bone aches from the contact. The smells are harsher here than within castle walls. Smoke from green wood chokes the air. The ground reeks of mud, sweat, and manure. Horses tethered nearby add their own pungent contribution, steaming in the cold. Food, when cooked, mingles with the smoke, a thin stew of barley or peas, bubbling weakly in an iron pot. The scent should comfort, but in such thin air it barely masks the stench of unwashed bodies and damp wool. You close your eyes, and the sounds rise around you. The whistle of wind through canvas, the crack of frozen branches, the groans of men turning restlessly on the hard ground. Snores still echo, but softer now, dampened by exhaustion and hunger. Somewhere, a soldier coughs wetly, the sound sharp and troubling. Illness was as much an enemy as the opposing army. Colds, fevers, and pneumonia claimed men silently in their sleep, and in the morning comrades sometimes woke beside those who would never stir again. And yet, there are flashes of humanity amid the misery. A soldier shares his cloak with another who has none. A group sings a low song, half prayer, half lullaby, its words lost but its rhythm steady. Laughter erupts briefly when a man tips into a snowbank, rising covered in frost like some ridiculous spirit. These moments, however fleeting, provided warmth not of the body but of the spirit. The dog who followed you in the hall is here too, curled in a heap of cloaks, paws twitching as it dreams. It yips once in its sleep, startling the men, then earns a laugh that breaks the monotony. Animals, once again, are companions and comforters in this brutal landscape. One soldier tries to create a pillow by folding his boots beneath his head. Another has dug a shallow trench and covered it with a shield, crawling beneath like a tortoise. Improvised ingenuity shows everywhere, proving that the line between misery and survival was drawn by creativity as much as endurance. Still, questions remain among historians about how armies kept morale in such conditions. Did commanders provide extra clothing and fuel, or did men scavenge desperately on their own? Some accounts describe supply lines delivering wool, straw, and even entire prefabricated huts for sieges. Others depict neglect, with soldiers left to their own devices while commanders slept in relative comfort. The fragmentary nature of the sources leaves this unclear, but what is certain is that soldiers had to adapt constantly, reshaping their environment with whatever tools they had. You wrap your cloak tighter around you in this vision, shivering despite the fire's glow. Your stomach growls, your fingers ache, and you understand why soldiers longed for the draughty safety of castle halls. The noise, the fleas, the straw, it was paradise compared to this frozen wasteland. But dawn always came. Slowly, the grey light would rise, spreading across tents and trenches, and men would stir from their shallow sleep. Horses would whinny, commanders would bark orders, and the campaign would grind forward as if the night had been nothing more than an unpleasant pause. Yet for many soldiers, those nights in the open scarred memory more deeply than battles ever did. As you drift back from the cold plain toward the imagined safety of stone walls, your mind catches on a more mundane but no less miserable reality. Even in castles, soldiers could not escape the nightly ritual of leaving their fragile warmth. When nature called, there was no chamber pot for most. The garde-robe, those frigid castle privies, waited in the dark, a dreaded interruption in an already difficult night. You wake with a start in the cold hall, your body wrapped in wool and straw, only to feel a different kind of urgency pressing upon you. The warmth you've so carefully hoarded, the fragile cocoon of cloak and hood, now risks being shattered by the unavoidable summons of nature. Few moments in a medieval soldier's night were more dreaded than this one, leaving the thin embrace of warmth to make the trek to the garde-robe. Contemporary records show clearly that castles were equipped with privies, often simple shafts, built into outer walls, allowing waste to drop away into cesspits or moats. For nobles, these chambers might even feature stone seats and modest partitions. For soldiers, however, the facilities were crude, cold, and often shared. Positioned along the walls for sanitation, they were draughty by design, with openings that funneled icy air directly into the user's face. To step into one at midnight was to step directly into winter's claws. A curious example survives from the Tower of London, where archaeological remains of garderobes show how even thick walls couldn't prevent the rush of cold air. Some reports describe snow drifting right into the seats through poorly covered chutes. Imagine sitting there, bare skin exposed, while icy wind whistled up beneath you, a misery so sharp that some soldiers delayed the trip as long as possible, even risking accidents rather than brave the frost. Not everyone agrees about how often these facilities were used at night. Modern scholars remain divided on whether soldiers regularly trudged to the garderobe in darkness or simply made use of makeshift chamber pots, buckets, jars, or even corners of the hall. Evidence exists for both. Some castle inventories list chamber pots among garrison supplies, suggesting men relieved themselves indoors during bitter nights. Others emphasize strict cleanliness rules, which likely forced soldiers outside despite the cold. The truth likely varied from place to place, depending on commanders' tolerance and the severity of weather. You picture yourself rising reluctantly from your straw, cloak slipping from your shoulders, the warmth escaping instantly. Your breath steams as you shuffle across the hall, boots clumping against stone. Each step feels like a punishment, your body shrinking against the draft, creeping through corridors. You push open a creaking wooden door and are met with a blast of frigid air that cuts straight through your shift. The smell of damp stone mingles with something fouler, a reminder that the privy is not a sanctuary, but a necessity. Inside, the chamber is barely lit by moonlight through a slit window. The stone seat is shockingly cold, almost biting. You lower yourself gingerly, teeth clenched against the chill, while wind whistles up from the chute. Every instinct screams at you to finish quickly. You imagine the hiss of snowflakes drifting into the opening, melting instantly against the warmth they meet. The entire act feels like a test of endurance more than relief. The sounds here are different from the hall. Instead of snores and crackling fire, you hear the hollow drip of water somewhere below, the faint moan of wind funneling through the chute, and the occasional creak of wood strained by cold. It feels eerie, as though you've stepped into the castle's hidden lungs. Some medieval people even believed garderobes were haunted, the dark shafts thought to harbour spirits or demons. Prayers scribbled near some privies hint at this superstition, though whether soldiers truly feared spirits or just disliked, the cold remains uncertain. Oddly enough, garderobes sometimes doubled as storage for valuable items, because the strong smell discouraged thieves. Records mention documents, and even money hidden in cupboards within privy chambers. Imagine sitting shivering in the dark, knowing that just above your head, wrapped in cloth, might be your lord's silver or the garrison's payroll. The irony of mixing treasure and filth is as medieval as it gets. You finish quickly, of course, pulling your cloak tight as you flee the chamber. The rush of relief is brief, overwhelmed by the sharp sting of cold against exposed skin. You hurry back down the corridor, longing for straw and warmth, every step reminding you of how fragile comfort is in this fortress. By the time you return to your pallet, your toes are numb, your cloak stiff with frost along its edges. You burrow deep again, curling close to your neighbours, desperate to reclaim what heat you've lost. Yet the trip leaves you thinking about another persistent enemy of warmth, not just the drafts or the cold stone, but the damp that seeped into everything. Bedding grew mouldy, straw turned musty, and the battle against mildew was fought every night as much as against the wind. The next stage of your night, then, is not about noise or necessity, but about the slow creeping moisture that clung to every corner of the medieval castle. You burrow back into your bedding, yet the chill lingers on your skin long after your return from the garderobe. It isn't just the icy air that makes you shiver, it's the dampness that never quite leaves these walls. Medieval castles were made of stone, and stone is a sponge. It soaks up moisture during rain, bleeds it out in mist, and breathes it into every corner of the hall. You lie there listening to the drip of water somewhere far above, and you realize that the true enemy isn't always the cold itself, it's the damp that clings like an invisible shroud. Written accounts from castle stewards reveal constant battles against mildew and rot. Straw bedding had to be replaced regularly because moisture from the air, the stone floors, and human sweat left it mouldy within weeks. Surviving housekeeping records from Windsor and other royal castles note shipments of straw arriving every few months, not just for animals, but specifically for beds of the garrison. The replacement wasn't about luxury, it was about survival. To sleep night after night on damp straw was to invite sickness into your bones. One curious anecdote comes from a 14th century steward's list in France, where it was noted that the bedding for guards was sprinkled with herbs such as lavender or mint. The purpose, according to later interpretations, may have been less about fragrance and more about fighting mold and pests. Picture a weary soldier collapsing onto straw that smells faintly of mint, the sweetness mingling with the sour odor of damp stone. A strange contrast, but perhaps a small comfort. Specialists continue to puzzle over just how serious the health effects of this dampness were. Some argue that respiratory illnesses, fevers, and the ever-present ague were made worse by the constant exposure to mouldy bedding. Others suggest that medieval constitutions were simply hardier, accustomed to damp environments in homes, barns, and castles alike. Without direct medical records for ordinary soldiers, the answer remains uncertain. Still, the repeated references to fresh straw and to drying cloth near fires imply that contemporaries took the problem seriously. You can almost smell it yourself, the sour tang of mildew rising from the straw, mixed with the smoky breath of the dying hearth. The fabric of your cloak feels clammy, never fully dry despite days near fire. When you shift your position, the straw beneath you releases a faint, musty scent, like old leaves left too long in rain. Your skin prickles where the damp touches, a cold that seeps deeper than mere air temperature, sinking into muscles and bones until even your dreams feel sodden. The soundscape adds to the impression. Beyond the snores and coughs, you hear the faint rustle of rats in the shadows, creatures that thrive in moist corners. Their tiny claws scrape along wood, their teeth gnaw at whatever scraps remain. You pull your cloak tighter, not only against the chill but against the thought of vermin crawling close. Fleas and lice, encouraged by the damp warmth of human and straw, feast happily whether men are awake or asleep. And yet, you notice the resilience with which soldiers adapted. Some spread their cloaks directly on the stone to keep bedding off the wet floor, creating a barrier between body and damp. Others hung straw mats or even branches beneath pallets to absorb moisture. Ingenuity shaped survival. In a few castles, wooden sleeping platforms were provided to lift men above the worst of the damp, though these were far from common. Each man invented his own way of denying the moisture entrance to his body. The psychological weight of the damp may have been as great as the physical. Chroniclers sometimes wrote of heavy air or bad air that oppressed the spirit, words that modern readers might interpret as references to mold or mildew. Imagine waking each morning with lungs heavy, clothes clammy, and spirits dulled. Fatigue was not only from battle or guard duty, it was bred by the environment itself. Oddly enough, dampness also created strange superstitions. Some soldiers believed that mildew carried evil humors, that sleeping too close to a wet wall might draw sickness from the stone. A few charms survive in manuscripts, invoking saints to dry the bones or lift the damp. Were these metaphors or literal fears? The answer is uncertain, but either way, the damp had taken on the aura of an invisible predator. You turn in your bedding again, straw crunching, cloak heavy. The moisture seems to seep through every layer, reminding you that no amount of fire or wool can completely chase it away. Still, you endure. You always endure. Perhaps tomorrow fresh straw will arrive. Perhaps the steward will order mats replaced. Until then, you breathe shallowly, willing your lungs to resist the mildew. As your eyes close, you wonder about another common image of the medieval soldier, the man who never takes off his armor. Did men truly sleep in their steel for fear of sudden alarm? Or did they shed it, preferring to risk exposure rather than suffocation. The debate is old, the answer's uncertain, and your mind drifts into the puzzle as the damp night presses on. The damp presses down until your bones ache, and in your half-sleep you begin to wonder about the image that has haunted countless tales and paintings: the soldier slumped in a corner, still clad in armor, helmet tilted forward, sword across his lap. Did they truly sleep this way? Was steel their mattress and shield their pillow? Or is this more of a romantic myth than a lived reality? Surviving accounts from campaigns suggest strongly that soldiers did not, as a rule, sleep fully armored. The weight alone made rest nearly impossible. A suit of mail might weigh 20 to 30 kilograms, pressing against joints and digging into shoulders. Plate, though better balanced, was equally impractical for long hours. What soldiers often did instead was sleep in their padded undergarments, the gambeson or arming doublet that were already warm and offered some protection in case of sudden attack. Helmets, breastplates, and gauntlets were removed, placed within reach, ready to be donned at a moment's alarm. An odd little story survives from the 14th century about an English squire who insisted on sleeping in his armor for 3 nights during a march, boasting of his endurance. On the 4th day, his companions found him barely able to lift his arms from fatigue and rash. They teased him mercilessly, calling him the Knight of Iron Dreams. Whether true or exaggerated, it highlights the absurdity of trying to rest in heavy steel. Scholars remain divided, however, on just how often men kept portions of armor on through the night. Some argue that in besieged castles or on active campaign, sentries and even ordinary soldiers may have slept in partial armor, unwilling to risk being caught unprepared. Others point out that surviving clothing inventories list extra gambesons and cloaks, suggesting that men valued comfort enough to strip off steel whenever possible. The debate reflects a lack of direct testimony. Soldiers rarely wrote detailed diaries of their nightly habits. You imagine yourself lying down in armor for a moment. The mail shirt digs into your ribs, each link pressing with its tiny circle of iron. The breastplate pins your chest, making breathing shallow and strained. Your shoulders throb beneath the weight, and your hips ache from the unyielding edge. When you turn, the plates scrape and clatter, waking your neighbors. Sweat builds beneath the padding, dampening the linen shift and making the chill worse once you stop moving. The fantasy of the armored sleeper quickly gives way to a very unromantic truth. No one could last long this way without misery. What most men likely did, you realize, was compromise. A soldier might keep on his boots and sword belt, sleeping with his blade close at hand. A helmet might remain near his head like a strange iron pillow, ready to be pulled on in alarm. The gambeson served as nightwear, doubling as armor padding and bedding alike. It was thick, quilted, and warm, scratchy perhaps, but better than bare stone. Cloaks layered over it completed the ensemble, creating a strange hybrid of readiness and rest. You turn on your straw bed and imagine the clutter of equipment around you. Spears leaned against walls, shields stacked in piles, helmets arranged like eerie faces staring in the dark. In such surroundings, even sleep was never free of battle. The castle hall doubled as armory, barracks, and dormitory. You slept where you fought, and you fought where you slept. The sensory world reinforces the point. Your ears ring with the faint clink of steel as a man shifts beside you, perhaps rolling onto his chainmail by mistake. The smell of oiled leather and iron mingles with the ever-present smoke. You can almost taste the tang of rust in the air. Every reminder points back to warfare. Even in dreams, you are never far from the tools of violence. And yet, there were advantages to having armor so near. One tale tells of a garrison in Germany, surprised by raiders at dawn. The soldiers, half-dressed, scrambled into their gear, some fastening helmets with one hand while wielding swords with the other. They drove off the attackers not because they slept in armor, but because the equipment was at hand. Readiness, not endurance, was the true strategy. Modern historians try to reconstruct the practicalities. Experiments with replica armor suggest that lying in full gear causes bruising within hours, while gambesons provide acceptable comfort for rest. Archaeological finds of bed linen stained with iron oxide hint that men often stored armor close to bedding, where damp air caused rust. These clues point toward a nightly rhythm. Strip the steel, keep the padding, and trust that alarms could be met in time. You sigh, pulling your cloak tighter, grateful that at least you are not shackled by metal tonight. But as you shift, scratching at your neck, another discomfort reminds you of its presence, one not easily shed by removing armor. Fleas, lice, and vermin lurked in every corner of castle life, thriving in straw, wool, and bodies. They were the companions no soldier could escape, whether armored or bare. Your mind drifts reluctantly toward this itchier reality, knowing that even sleep came with its own crawling burdens. The next chapter of your night is not about steel, but about the vermin that shared every medieval bed. You scratch absently at your collarbone, then your calf, then the back of your neck. The sensation isn't imagined. It's the familiar irritation of tiny bodies crawling where they don't belong. Fleas and lice were as constant as the cold in a medieval castle. No matter how many layers of wool you wore, no matter how tightly you pulled your cloak around you, the little creatures wriggled, bit, and thrived in the warmth you so carefully tried to keep for yourself. Chronic sources describe plainly that infestations were an everyday reality. Fleas thrived in the straw bedding, while lice hid in the seams of wool garments and in the hair of men who rarely bathed. Castle records occasionally mention payments for herbs or powders to fumigate chambers, but these were only temporary measures. Even kings and queens complained of vermin in their beds, so for common soldiers the expectation was simple. You shared your nights with biting companions. Oddly enough, some soldiers almost joked about it. One French account mentions men calling their fleas bedfellows, and remarking that they kept one from freezing. It was gallows humour, of course, but not entirely false. Where fleas thrived, warmth was guaranteed. Imagine soldiers slapping at their legs in unison, laughing through gritted teeth about their loyal companions. The humour made the misery tolerable. Researchers continue to debate how men attempted to fight infestations. Some argue that laundering was far more common than stereotypes suggest, with garrisons maintaining wash days for clothing and bedding. Archaeological finds of wash basins and soap residues support this view. Others counter that frequent washing was impractical in cold months, when drying was nearly impossible, leaving vermin unchecked. Certain medical texts mention rubbing bodies with vinegar or smearing cloaks with strong-smelling herbs to deter lice, though whether such remedies worked is another matter. The evidence leaves room for interpretation, with no single picture emerging. You shift on your pallet, scratching harder now. The straw beneath you rustles, and you realize that it is alive not only with fleas but with rats. Their faint squeaks echo in the dark, claws scuttling across beams, whiskers twitching as they nose through scraps of bread. You pull your cloak tighter, less in fear than in resignation. Vermin were part of the ecosystem of castles drawn by food stores, livestock, and humans. To live here was to accept their presence. The sensory assault is overwhelming. The itch of bites, the squeak of rats, the musty smell of straw mingled with droppings. You slap at your arm and feel the satisfying crunch of a flea between fingers, only to know that dozens more remain. Your scalp itches, your ankles burn, and you sigh. This, perhaps more than the cold, was the true misery of nightly life, the endless crawling that mocked every attempt at rest. And yet, adaptation shows itself again. Some soldiers shaved their heads to fight lice, wearing hoods or caps for warmth instead of relying on hair. Others dusted their bedding with ashes or sand, believing the grit deterred insects. Cats were kept not only for mice but for their reputation as vermin hunters in general. Even dogs, with their thick fur, distracted fleas from men by serving as more attractive hosts. Survival meant negotiation with pests as much as with weather. One story tells of a garrison in Germany where men burned their straw bedding every spring, convinced it purged the demon fleas. New straw was brought in, and for a few blessed nights, the itching subsided. Within weeks, though, the creatures returned. It was a Sisyphean battle waged over centuries, never won. The mental toll was real. Sleepless nights made tempers short, bred quarrels and frayed nerves. Chroniclers hint that vermin were sometimes seen as punishments for sin or tests of endurance, wrapping theology around biology. To scratch through the night was to remind oneself of human frailty, perhaps even divine displeasure. Whether you believed such tales or not, you could not ignore the bites. And so you roll onto your side, scratching still, wondering if the monks in their quiet monasteries faced the same torment. In truth, they did. Monastic records speak of strict washing routines, but even monks complained of lice in their habits and fleas in their straw. Their rules may have shaped order in the day, but at night, vermin did not discriminate between soldier and saint. As your eyes grow heavy despite the itching, you begin to think of those monks and their disciplined patterns of sleep. Their habits, their schedules, their night prayers, all of it left an imprint on castle life, including the way soldiers rested. Soon, your mind drifts toward the rhythm of monastic influence and how it bled into the barracks of stone fortresses. You scratch one last time at your scalp, sigh, and let your thoughts drift toward a different kind of order, one that belonged not to the barracks, but to the cloister. For while soldiers slept in chaos, surrounded by snores and vermin, their nightly rhythms were often shaped by a far more disciplined world, the monastery. Castles and monasteries stood side by side in medieval landscapes, and their practices, especially the structured hours of sleep and prayer, often influenced each other more than you might imagine. Medieval sources consistently note that monastic life revolved around the canonical hours, a strict schedule of prayers that punctuated the day and night. Monks rose at midnight for matins, prayed again at dawn, and continued through the hours until nightfall. Though soldiers were no monks, their routines were shaped by this same rhythm. Guard rotations and wake-up calls often mirrored the bells of nearby abbeys, and the expectation of breaking sleep into shifts echoed the monastic habit of rising in the night. A curious little overlap emerges in the records. Some castles with attached chapels or resident priests actually enforced night prayers for their garrisons. Soldiers, bleary-eyed from cold and fleas, were summoned to recite psalms or short devotions before returning to their straw. One 13th century account even mentions guards reciting the Pater Noster aloud on patrol, a practice likely inherited from monastic discipline. Imagine the surreal sight: armored men marching the walls at night, mumbling prayers into the wind, part devotion, part attempt to stay awake. Experts remain divided on how much this monastic influence truly shaped everyday barrack life. Some argue it was superficial, mere gestures of piety layered over the practical needs of watch duty. Others maintain that the very structure of soldierly existence, alternating sleep, watch, and meal times, was modelled on the regimented hours of the cloister. With evidence scattered across chronicles, the argument remains unresolved, though the parallels are striking. You picture yourself now, lying in the hall, half asleep when a small bell clatters somewhere in the darkness. It is not for worship tonight, but for duty, the call for a guard change. Yet the rhythm of waking at intervals feels familiar, inherited from monks who had been breaking their sleep for centuries. You groan, tug your hood lower, and are grateful that this time the summons is for someone else. Still, the sound plants itself in your dream, reminding you that your rest is never uninterrupted. The sensory impression of monastic influence lingers in subtle ways. The faint smell of incense drifts from the chapel, mixing strangely with smoke and straw. The sound of a priest's murmured chant may carry through stone corridors, weaving itself into the snore chorus of the barracks. Even gestures of devotion men crossing themselves before sleep, muttering prayers against demons and frost, echo the spiritual discipline that shaped medieval nights. And here lies another curious anecdote. In some garrisons, monks or chaplains taught soldiers short hymns that doubled as lullabies. A fragment survives in a manuscript describing a tune sung by men in Normandy, supposedly both a prayer for safety and a rhythm to soothe weary minds. You imagine the hushed voices of soldiers humming in the dark, not unlike monks chanting in their cloisters, the two worlds converging in the simple desire for rest. But while monks embraced broken sleep as a spiritual discipline, soldiers endured it reluctantly. Their interrupted nights were born of necessity: alarms, guard rotations, sudden drills. The result was the same sleep in fragments, never deep, always shallow. Modern researchers still puzzle over how such fractured sleep affected performance. Did men adapt, as monks seemed to, or did fatigue drag them down in subtle ways? The evidence leaves no simple answer, only hints of tired bodies and bleary mornings. You shift again on your pallet, pulling your cloak close, and think about how this blend of soldierly necessity and monastic discipline created a rhythm unique to castle life. Nights were not a single block of slumber. They were cycles of waking, praying, watching, and sleeping again. The human body adjusted, grudgingly, to this pattern, finding rest where it could. Still, fatigue took its toll. You can see it in the faces of your imagined comrades, men collapsing into straw without removing boots, mouths open as they snore through exhaustion. Battle itself was not always what broke soldiers. It was the ceaseless drain of nights like these, where true rest was elusive, where the cold, noise, and duty gnawed at body and spirit. And so your mind lingers on that fatigue, the kind that seeps so deep you hardly care where you sleep. Soldiers learn to collapse anywhere: on straw, in stables, under cloaks, driven by exhaustion more than comfort. The monastic rhythm may have shaped the structure, but fatigue was the real master. The next part of the night, then, belongs to this reality: the sheer, unrelenting weight of battle, weariness that could make even the coldest stone feel like a bed. Your body grows heavier, the itch of vermin and the damp of stone fading beneath a far stronger force: exhaustion. Battle fatigue is not the sharp pain of a wound or the sudden shock of cold. It is slower, heavier, a gravity that drags your limbs down no matter where you lie. For a medieval soldier, this weariness was perhaps the most reliable sedative of all. Contemporary chronicles describe soldiers collapsing into sleep in whatever position they found themselves: on straw, on benches, against the wall, with helmets still in hand. A campaign diary from the 100 Years' War even notes that men sometimes fell asleep while eating, food still clutched in their fingers, so drained were they from marches and skirmishes. Sleep was not a choice. It was a surrender. A man could rest through shouting, through the barking of dogs, even through the chill of stone floors, simply because his body gave him no other option. One particularly vivid account from a Burgundian soldier tells of men bedding down on the battlefield itself, among broken weapons and discarded shields, too tired to care about comfort or safety. They lay in the mud, helmets as pillows, cloaks draped over their faces, and slept as though they had never known featherbeds. The image is both tragic and oddly reassuring. Humans can endure almost anything when exhaustion forces the body to ignore all else. Yet modern scholars remain divided on whether such profound fatigue truly compensated for harsh conditions. Some argue that physical exhaustion allowed men to sleep deeply even in bitter cold, granting genuine rest. Others suggest the opposite, that constant wakefulness, interrupted by shallow dozing, left soldiers chronically sleep-deprived, weakening their immune systems and dulling their alertness. The limited medical records leave this an open question, but the debate underscores the paradox. Exhaustion helped men sleep, but may also have broken them slowly. You imagine the sensation yourself. Your body aches after a day of guard duty and hauling supplies. Your arms are heavy from carrying weapons. Your legs burn from climbing towers. When at last you lie down, the stone feels almost soft, the straw almost luxurious. Your cloak scratches, your hood itches, but none of it matters. Your eyelids close with the force of a hammer, and the world recedes into darkness. The soundscape shifts when you are this tired. Snores no longer irritate you. They blur into the background, a hum that barely registers. The rustle of rats, the drip of water, even the cough of a neighbor all fade into nothing. Your mind drifts in and out, sometimes awake, sometimes half dreaming, sometimes unaware of which state you're in. This fractured sleep becomes the soldier's normal. And here lies a curious little anecdote. Some accounts mention soldiers sleeping while standing, leaning on their spears or shields. During long sieges, men supposedly nodded off against walls, still upright, their weight balanced by armor and weapons. Whether this is literal truth or an exaggeration, the imagery captures the essence of fatigue so deep that posture itself ceased to matter. The smells around you linger as you drift. Smoke from dying embers, damp wool, the sour tang of sweat. They no longer repel you. Exhaustion dulls every sense until all that remains is the heavy comfort of shutting down. The dog by your side barely stirs, equally worn out, its body pressed close, as if sharing in your collapse. You recall that even nobles, despite better bedding, sometimes described the same overwhelming sleep. One lord at Calais complained of slumber taking me against my will, after days of overseeing a siege. Whether wrapped in fur blankets or rough cloaks, fatigue was universal, binding knight and foot soldier alike. But fatigue also carried dangers. A sentry might doze on duty, risking the safety of all. A man might roll too near a brazier, his cloak catching fire while he slept too soundly to wake. Others might miss alarms, roused only when commanders shook them violently. Sleep was both salvation and risk, an unpredictable ally in a world of constant hardship. Researchers continue to discuss whether medieval soldiers truly achieved restorative rest in such circumstances. Some argue that their bodies, accustomed to physical labor from youth, were better suited to brief, irregular sleep than modern bodies. Others counter that constant illness and high mortality prove that such adaptation had limits. Again, the truth remains elusive, lost between chronicles that highlight endurance and those that emphasize suffering. You lie deeper now in your imagined exhaustion. The hall, the straw, the damp, they all blur. You could be anywhere. Under a tree, in a trench, on a battlefield. The world reduces to the rhythm of breath and the weight of your own body pressing downward. This is what fatigue does. It erases environment, silences discomfort, and demands only rest. And yet, as you drift, your mind conjures another image. Not all soldiers were lucky enough to find stone walls above their heads or straw beneath their backs. Many improvised even inside castle yards, turning cloaks and shields into tents, crafting little shelters against the drafts. If fatigue drove men to collapse anywhere, ingenuity sometimes softened the fall. Your thoughts wander toward these improvised tents, the makeshift shelters that dotted castle courtyards when space and comfort ran short. The hall fades, and you find yourself stepping into a castle yard under the stars. The walls rise high and dark around you, broken only by the torchlight of sentries pacing above. Down here, the air is raw and biting, yet scattered across the yard are odd little constructions, cloaks strung over spears, shields leaned together, bits of canvas pegged down with stones. These are the improvised tents of soldiers who could not squeeze into the hall or who preferred to make their own corners of shelter. Contemporary accounts of sieges and garrison life show clearly that improvised tents and lean-tos were common within castle grounds. Not every fortress had room to house its full complement of men under stone roofs, especially during wartime when reinforcements swelled numbers. In such cases, soldiers spread across the yard, hanging cloaks over ropes, propping shields against walls, and even draping horse blankets between barrels. Archaeologists have unearthed signs of such temporary shelters, post holes, scorched earth from small fires, and scraps of iron tent pegs in unexpected places. There's even a whimsical anecdote in a 15th century chronicle about men-at-arms who stitched their cloaks together with twine to create one oversized tent. When a gust of wind ripped it free, the contraption flew across the yard like a sail, sending the soldiers tumbling after it. The chronicler's tone makes it sound like slapstick comedy, yet the detail reveals how desperate men were for shelter and how inventive they could be with limited materials. Specialists continue to disagree on how comfortable these makeshift structures truly were. Some argue they provided real respite from wind and rain, noting that even a thin barrier could cut drafts significantly. Others suggest they were more symbolic than functional, offering a sense of enclosure but little genuine warmth. The debate persists, for while fragments of canvas and tent pegs survive, no medieval soldier left us a detailed diary about how it felt to sleep under a cloak strung across two spears. You crouch inside one of these makeshift shelters now. It is small, barely tall enough to sit upright, barely wide enough to curl on the ground. Your cloak drapes overhead, weighed down by stones at the corners, forming a low tent that blocks the wind. Inside, the air feels stiller, less cruel. You spread straw across the earth, perhaps stolen from stables, and lie down. The fabric above smells of smoke and damp wool, but it is yours, your little fortress within the fortress. The sensory experience is sharp. The rough ground presses into your side, but the tent walls flap gently, a reminder that you are shielded from the gusts outside. You hear muffled sounds of others in their own shelters, low murmurs, the occasional cough, the bark of a dog. The air is still cold, but the act of enclosure gives comfort far beyond the physical. It is proof of agency, of having carved out a private bubble in a communal world. One quirky custom mentioned in a garrison report is the use of shields not only as tent walls but as beds themselves. Large kite shields, turned concave side up, could cradle a body off the wet ground. Men joked about sleeping in their lord's arms, the painted emblems becoming literal headboards. You smile at the absurd practicality of it, iron and wood, repurposed as furniture by necessity. Of course, the drawbacks were many. Rain seeped through poorly tied seams, wind snapped ropes, and snow could collapse a cloak tent in minutes. Rats and vermin crept beneath the edges, undeterred by fabric walls. Some soldiers even described waking to find their improvised shelter had frozen stiff, trapping them beneath stiffened wool until comrades pulled it apart. Still, men persisted, because even flawed shelter was better than lying bare under the sky. Experts remain uncertain about whether commanders approved of these structures. Did they encourage men to make them, seeing their value? Or did they prefer to keep courtyards clear for drills and movement? Some regulations suggest tents were allowed only in designated areas, while others hint at punishment for cluttering the yard. The evidence is inconclusive, but the very existence of so many anecdotes implies that, official or not, men found ways to claim space for themselves. As you lie inside your little cloak tent, you notice how your imagination responds differently here than in the hall. There is no choir of snores, no suffocating smoke. Instead, there is a quiet intimacy, the soft scrape of fabric in the breeze, the smell of your own cloak surrounding you, the faint glow of moonlight filtering through threads. It feels like a child's fort, fragile yet protective. Sleep comes not from comfort but from the illusion of security. The dog from earlier noses its way into your tent, curls at your knees, and sighs. You adjust your cloak to cover it too, realizing that warmth is never a solitary victory. In these little shelters, companionship mattered as much as cloth. Two bodies under one cloak doubled the heat, and so tents often housed pairs or trios. Soldiers joked that the real danger was not the cold, but the stench of comrades crammed so close. And here, as your eyes grow heavy, another memory surfaces. Not all tents were improvised. After feasts in the great hall, some men simply dozed by the hearth, cloaks thrown across their faces, the embers still glowing. Those lucky few drifted to sleep in warmth and smoke, dreaming in the flicker of firelight. Compared to the cloak tents of the courtyard, that must have felt like paradise. So your mind turns toward those feasts and their lingering heat, the way fire and fellowship merged to soften the edge of medieval nights. As you surrender to drowsiness, the thought of embers glowing in the great hall beckons you inward, toward warmth of a different kind. You step back into the castle's great hall, and the atmosphere is transformed. Tonight is no ordinary night of scratching straw and muffled snores. It is a feast night. The long tables still bear the remnants of food, bones picked nearly clean, trenchers of bread gone stale, greasy platters that smell of roasted meat. Candles gutter in pools of wax, and the central hearth burns brighter than usual, a great blaze fed all evening with oak and pine. The warmth lingers, wrapping the hall in a rare softness. For once, the cold is pushed back a little farther into the corners. It is well recorded in household accounts that great feasts not only filled bellies but also provided warmth that lasted long into the night. Fires were stoked high for guests, and the crowded company of men, women, animals, and servants all contributed body heat. The stone chamber that so often felt like a refrigerator was, on feast nights, almost cozy. Men fell asleep where they sat, heads on tables, bodies stretched near the hearth, unwilling to move back to the colder barracks. Oddly enough, chronicles sometimes poke fun at this indulgence. One monk in the 13th century described a group of soldiers sleeping like swine after a feast, collapsed in tangled heaps around the fire, snoring with greasy hands still clutching cups. It was meant as a moral jab at gluttony, but the detail is revealing. The hearth after feasts became a dormitory of its own. The embers provided warmth through the first half of the night, and soldiers gladly abandoned their straw pallets for the chance to drift off under its glow. Academic opinion splits on whether these feast nights made any long-term difference in soldierly health. Some argue that the extra food and fire offered real reprieve, restoring energy and easing illness. Others suggest the excess of wine and ale, combined with the sudden warmth, left men more vulnerable to sickness when they finally staggered back to the draughts of their chambers. Without systematic medical evidence, the debate remains unresolved, but in the moment, warmth was worth every risk. You imagine yourself seated at a long wooden bench, cloak tossed across your shoulders, belly heavy with stew and bread. The fire crackles so loudly you can hear sap popping, and smoke curls upward into the rafters. The warmth hits your face, flushing your cheeks, and you lean back with a sigh. Around you, men laugh and sing, their voices slurring into the late hours. Dogs lick at the scraps on the floor. Cats slink between benches, and even the horses in the nearby stables seem to stamp less from the cold, lulled by the noise and heat of the hall. The sensory richness is overwhelming. The smell of roasted venison still lingers, spiced with pepper and cloves for the Lord's table, though your share was likely gristle and broth. Ale sloshes in cups, spilled across boards and soaking into bread. The tang of smoke mixes with the perfume of herbs scattered on the rushes underfoot. For once, the mixture of odours feels less oppressive and more alive, a tapestry of indulgence instead of deprivation. Gradually, laughter fades. Men slump forward, arms folded on tables, or sprawl directly on the rushes, their boots steaming from melted snow. Some remove nothing, cloaks still on, hoods pulled low. Others unbuckle belts and swords, dropping them carelessly at their sides. The glow of the hearth becomes softer, the hall quieter, the fire the only voice left. You feel yourself drawn to it, leaning closer, basking in its heat until your skin prickles. One peculiar tradition noted in a few accounts is that of deliberately leaving embers banked for sleeping soldiers. The steward or firekeeper would spread ashes over the logs so they smouldered slowly through the night, releasing enough warmth to keep those nearest from freezing. It was a practical kindness. Though not entirely selfless, the steward himself often slept nearby, benefiting equally from the lingering glow. You picture the gradual rhythm. The hall darkens, men collapse in uneven rows around the hearth, and snores begin again, softer now under the lull of food and fire. The glow paints faces in red and gold, flickering across helmets stacked against the wall, glinting on sword pommels left within reach. The hall seems alive with light and shadow, a place where danger is forgotten, at least until dawn. Yet not all historians agree on how frequent such nights of warmth really were. Some argue that feasts were rare, tied to holy days and lordly whims, while ordinary nights reverted quickly to cold and hunger. Others maintain that even minor gatherings could create similar conditions, as long as a fire was fed generously. The surviving sources are biased toward noble life, leaving the soldier's version of feasts half in shadow. Still, you cannot deny the impression. A fire-fed night in a crowded hall could lift spirits, soothe bones, and offer something like genuine sleep. For a few hours, soldiers forgot draughts, fleas, and damp. They dreamed with full bellies and flushed cheeks, lulled by the embers that glowed long after song had ended. And as dawn broke, the rhythm returned. The fire cooled, scraps were cleared, and men filed back to their duties, carrying only the memory of a night when the castle walls had felt almost hospitable. But seasons changed, and so did the length of nights. Winter stretched sleep long, while summer cut it short. Your thoughts begin to drift toward these rhythms. The way the turning of the year shaped how medieval soldiers slept, sometimes with endless darkness, sometimes with barely enough night to close their eyes. The fire of feast nights dims in your mind, replaced by the greater rhythm that governs all life, the seasons. You begin to notice how the very length of night itself shapes your sleep. In winter, the darkness stretches endlessly, the sun vanishing in late afternoon and returning reluctantly only after long hours. In summer, the sky glows late and bright, leaving only a brief pause for rest. Soldiers in castles, like peasants in fields, lived by this clock not of gears but of stars and seasons. Medieval chronicles repeatedly note that people's sleep was segmented by the seasons. In the deep of winter, nights were so long that soldiers often slept in two distinct stretches. First sleep, broken by a period of wakefulness, then second sleep before dawn. This pattern, sometimes called biphasic sleep, was described by scholars as ordinary. Men might wake in the middle of the night to pray, to talk quietly, to check on fires, or simply to shift positions before dozing again. Summer nights, by contrast, barely allowed for a single stretch of slumber before morning duty called them to arms. A curious little detail appears in some accounts. Soldiers during long winter nights sometimes passed the midnight interval, telling stories or even gambling with dice, using the break between sleeps as an informal recreation. One garrison in the Low Countries was noted for keeping a box of dice in the guardroom, used most heavily in the small hours when wakefulness crept in. It paints a lively, if unromantic, picture. Men huddled in cloaks, eyes drooping, shaking dice for pennies while snow pressed against the walls outside. Modern historians disagree on how consciously medieval people recognized this split sleep pattern. Some argue that it was so normal it wasn't even remarked upon, while others believe the scattered references point to a widely shared but not universal practice. Either way, the rhythms of nature dictated the rhythms of sleep. Long nights were not filled entirely with dreams. They were punctuated by waking moments, small tasks, and quiet reflections. You picture a castle in midwinter. The sun has vanished by late afternoon, leaving men to eat by firelight and then collapse into their bedding. Hours later, one by one, they stir awake. Some stoke the embers of the fire, others shuffle to the garderobe, still others whisper to neighbors or hum low tunes. A few rise to pray, perhaps muttering the Lord's Prayer in the quiet, before lying back down. Then, after an hour or two, the hall settles again into second sleep, carrying them until dawn. The sensory world of this winter sleep is striking. The hall is darker, colder, yet quieter, broken only by the shuffle of straw and the occasional spark from embers. You smell the sharpness of cold air seeping through cracks, mixing with the damp scent of wool. You hear low murmurs, perhaps a story passed from one man to another, a tale of home or of battles past. The rhythm of sleep and wake, broken yet continuous, becomes part of the soldier's night. Contrast this with summer. Imagine a June evening when the sun lingers late, flooding the hall with light until almost bedtime. Men lie down still, sweaty from patrols or work, their cloaks tossed aside because the heat is too heavy. The darkness lasts only a few hours, and even then the air is stuffy, thick with insects and sweat. At dawn, roosters crow and light spills through arrow slits before the men have truly rested. Summer sleep is shorter, hotter, more restless. One peculiar anecdote from a 14th century English garrison describes soldiers stringing damp cloth across open windows in summer, hoping to cool the air as night breezes filtered through. The trick likely failed more often than it worked, but the image lingers, men inventing primitive cooling systems, turning castles into fumbling prototypes of air-conditioned barracks. Researchers are still uncertain how much seasonal rhythm shaped soldiers' health. Did longer winter nights allow more complete rest, balancing the deprivation of summer? Or did the damp and cold of winter undo any benefit from extra hours? Opinions differ, and the lack of detailed records leaves the matter unresolved. What remains clear is that sleep was never uniform. It bent and shifted with the tilt of the year. You lie on your straw, imagining the contrast. In winter, you wake in the deep night, eyes catching the faint glow of embers, ears filled with whispers and shuffling. In summer, you barely close your eyes before light floods back in, the heat pressing down, the sound of flies buzzing even in the dark. The seasons themselves command when you rest, how you rest, and how deeply you dream. But castles were not filled only with soldiers. Families sometimes lived within the walls too, wives, children, servants, all sharing the same nights and the same struggles. As you roll onto your side, you think of them, the children huddling under cloaks, the mothers shushing them, the families making warmth together in narrow chambers. The rhythm of soldierly sleep was shaped not only by seasons but also by the presence of kin within the fortress. The sound of snoring fades into something gentler, a memory of laughter and softer voices. For while the great hall belonged mostly to soldiers, many castles also sheltered families. Servants, cooks, blacksmiths, and sometimes even the wives and children of men-at-arms lived within the walls. Their presence shaped the rhythm of sleep in ways you can almost feel less martial, more domestic, but still under the same roof of stone. Surviving castle accounts make it clear that family life existed alongside garrisons. Payrolls include stipends for wives, rations for children, and notes about servants who shared chambers with their employers. In smaller castles especially, it was common for families to cluster together at night in narrow rooms or lofts above workshops. Soldiers returning from duty might share straw with their kin. The warmth of bodies multiplied not just by comradeship, but by blood. A curious little glimpse appears in a 14th century steward's roll from Scotland. Two wives with infants sleeping in the buttery loft, straw provided by the steward. It is an unassuming line, but it reveals a world where the cries of babies mingled with the snores of guards, where the rhythm of castle life was more than drills and duty. The reality of medieval nights was messier, warmer, and more human than the stark image of armoured men alone in barracks. Scholars remain uncertain about how widespread the presence of families in castles truly was. Some argue that most garrisons kept domestic life outside the walls, pointing to rules forbidding women and children within the keep. Others counter that practical necessity, laundry, cooking, nursing, and companionship meant such bans were often ignored. Archaeological finds of toys, sewing needles, and small shoes inside castle sites suggest that children were more common within walls than official records admit. The evidence, as always, leaves space for interpretation. You imagine it now, a corner of the hall partitioned by cloth, where a mother hushes her child, rocking the little one against her chest. The firelight glows on the child's face, softening the harsh atmosphere of the barracks. The smell of milk lingers faintly among the usual odours of smoke and straw. The dog from earlier curls near the child's feet, a guardian as much as a companion. This scene feels startlingly tender in a fortress built for war. The sensory contrasts are striking. While soldiers grunt and toss on straw pallets, children whimper softly, mothers murmur lullabies, and the scratch of a spindle might continue into the night as a wife mends torn clothing by firelight. The air smells less of sweat and iron here, more of bread crusts and wool, though the background of smoke is never absent. The sounds of family blur into the soldierly chorus until they are inseparable, one great mixture of survival. One odd practice mentioned in a few chronicles is that children were sometimes placed in the warmest spots by hearths, or even nestled between sleeping adults in the hall. Child between two, a phrase in one record, suggests a deliberate method of keeping little bodies alive in harsh winters. It echoes the same instinct soldiers had when huddling for warmth, survival through closeness, whether among comrades or kin. The presence of families also altered the psychology of sleep. Soldiers lying beside their wives or children may have found greater comfort, a sense of stability amid the chaos of war. Yet it also created vulnerability. The same chroniclers who recorded playful images of children in halls also mention tragedies, raids, where women and children were caught inside castles under siege, forced to endure the same privations as the men. Their cries in the night would have been a grim reminder of what was at stake. Modern researchers still debate how much domestic presence shaped morale. Some argue that families inside castles provided crucial emotional anchors, reducing desertion and increasing soldiers' willingness to endure hardship. Others believe the opposite, that distractions of family life complicated discipline and blurred the lines of martial order. Both interpretations hold truth, perhaps depending on the lord, the castle, and the season. You nestle into your straw, and the image of a mother rocking her child lingers. The fire crackles faintly, muffling the cries, and the hall feels less like a barracks and more like a village under one roof. You imagine the comfort that must have brought, even to men without families of their own, the sense that the fortress held not just warriors but life itself. Still, not every night carried such warmth. Families might soften the edges of hardship, but when the castle came under siege, everyone inside, soldier, wife, child, servant, shared the same deprivation. Food grew scarce, fuel dwindled, and nights became colder than ever. Your thoughts drift toward those harshest of times, when even within walls, survival of the night was uncertain. The image of a mother's lullaby fades, replaced by the hollow echo of drums and the grim silence of a castle under siege. In times like these, the rhythm of night changed completely. No longer were the halls filled with feasting or laughter. Instead, the atmosphere was tense. Food was rationed, fuel dwindled, and every man, woman, and child inside the walls slept or tried to under the shadow of hunger and fear. Surviving chronicles make it clear that sieges often dragged on for months, sometimes more than a year. During that time, castles became prisons as much as fortresses. Nights were punctuated not by snores alone, but by the rumble of siege engines outside, the thud of stones against walls, and the cries of sentries warning of attack. Sleep was shallow, constantly broken, shaped by the knowledge that the enemy never truly rested. One particularly grim anecdote comes from the siege of Château Gaillard in 1203. Starving soldiers and civilians inside the fortress reportedly huddled together in desperate attempts to keep warm, as wood supplies dwindled and fires were rationed to the barest embers. Some accounts describe people gnawing on leather or bones to still their hunger, their nights restless not from cold alone, but from the hollow gnawing of their stomachs. Imagine trying to close your eyes while your body screams for food, the chill amplifying every pang. Modern historians remain divided over how much nightly life deteriorated during long sieges. Some argue that defenders maintained routines, rotating guards, banking fires, rationing straw to preserve morale. Others suggest that chaos inevitably crept in, with exhaustion, hunger, and fear eroding discipline until nights were nothing more than shivering endurance. Archaeological digs of siege layers show evidence of both. Careful organization in some castles, but signs of desperation in others, such as burnt animal bones and hastily dug fire pits. You picture yourself lying on straw during a siege. The fire has been reduced to glowing coals, barely enough to light the chamber. Cloaks are pulled tighter than ever, bodies pressed closer, but the warmth feels weaker. The air smells not of roasted meat, but of boiled roots, of thin broth ladled sparingly. The hall no longer hums with chatter. It murmurs instead with prayers, whispers of despair, the quiet sob of a child muffled in a mother's cloak. The sensory world is harsher here. Smoke still lingers, but thinner, for fuel is precious. The air is damp and heavy, as drafts slip through cracks left by bombardment. Your belly growls, sharp and painful, making sleep elusive. Every creak of timber, every far-off shout from the walls jolts you awake. Dreams are haunted not by comfort, but by the looming presence of an enemy just beyond the stones. Yet even in such misery, resilience flickered. Chronicles mention soldiers telling stories in whispers during siege nights, trying to distract themselves and their families. Dice and cards reappear, played by firelight with tokens that were often scraps of bone or wood. One tale describes defenders at Rouen joking bitterly that rats were the new venison, turning even the horror of starvation into gallows humor. These small rituals offered a kind of psychological insulation, wrapping men's minds in something warmer than their cloaks could provide. A striking detail survives from a 15th century account. During a winter siege, soldiers reportedly slept in shifts, not only for guard duty, but to conserve body heat. One group would huddle together for a few hours while another kept watch. Then they would trade places, ensuring that each cluster retained at least some warmth. It was a strategy born of scarcity, where even sleep became part of the rationing system. Still, questions remain about how often such routines truly held. Some experts argue that siege conditions must have led to widespread illness from damp, vermin, and malnutrition. Others believe that discipline and faith kept men steady, their nightly prayers as important as their nightly cloaks. The absence of soldiers' voices in the records leaves us guessing, piecing together fragments into a picture that is vivid yet incomplete. You lie there in the siege night, pulling your hood over your face, trying to block out hunger and fear. Your body trembles with cold, but worse still is the awareness of footsteps echoing above the guards who cannot sleep at all. You envy them, in a way, because exhaustion might keep them from thinking about empty bellies. You turn, straw crunching, and will yourself to forget. But memory lingers of better nights, of feast embers, and families huddled close. You cling to those memories as warmth of a different sort, proof that not every night was misery. And slowly, as your mind drifts, you begin to think of the difference between rich and poor within castle walls. For while soldiers slept in straw and vermin, the lords and ladies above rested in beds with hangings and fur. The contrast is sharp, and it shapes your next thought. How different must sleep have felt in noble chambers, even under the same stone roof? The whispers of the besieged hall fade, and you climb, if only in your imagination, up the spiral staircases that wind toward the lord's chambers. Here the night is no less dark, but the quality of sleep feels markedly different. Instead of open floors strewn with straw, you step into a chamber lined with tapestries, the draught softened by heavy hangings, and a bed raised on a wooden frame. This was the noble's privilege, the chance to turn sleep from mere survival into something resembling comfort. Castle inventories from the 13th and 14th centuries confirm this difference clearly. They list feather mattresses, linen sheets, fur blankets, and bed curtains among the possessions of noble families. Some beds were so large that entire households might have slept together in them. Lord, lady, children, even favoured servants. While soldiers huddled under cloaks, the elite closed curtains around their four posters, creating a private tent within stone walls. These curtains trapped heat, blocked drafts, and gave a cocoon-like effect that the common barracks could never rival. One eccentric detail appears in a wardrobe account of Edward III. His bedclothes included squirrel, fur linings, thought to be both warm and a mark of status. Imagine drifting off with dozens of tiny pelts stitched together into one blanket, their soft underfur brushing against your face. To modern ears it sounds bizarre, but to nobles, fur meant not only warmth but wealth, a display of resources even in sleep. Historians, however, remain divided on how much warmer these noble chambers actually were compared to the great hall below. Some argue that tapestries, hangings, and smaller chambers did create a noticeable difference, raising temperatures enough to banish frost from the air. Others point out that even noble bedrooms often had stone floors, single hearths, and poor insulation. They may have been less freezing, but they were not truly warm by modern standards. Archaeological studies of castles with reconstructed chambers show only modest differences in temperature. Still, compared to the exposed barracks, the luxury was real. You lower yourself onto such a bed in your imagination. The mattress, filled with feathers, sighs beneath your weight, far softer than straw. Linen sheets, cool at first, warm quickly against your skin. A heavy blanket of wool and fur presses down with comforting weight. Above you, curtains drawn close shut out the draught and muffle the snores of the hall. The air smells less of smoke and mold here, more of herbs tucked into bedding, lavender, rosemary, perhaps even dried rose petals. These were not just perfumes, they were believed to protect against illness and ward off bad dreams. The sensory difference is striking. Instead of the constant scratching of fleas, you feel the smooth glide of linen. Instead of straw rustling beneath you, the mattress cradles you. The crackle of a private hearth fills the chamber, its glow flickering across embroidered hangings. Even the sounds are hushed. The curtains and smaller space create quiet, a luxury in itself. And yet, even nobles were not free from disturbance. Accounts note that servants often slept on pallets at the foot of their masters' beds, ready to fetch water or stir the fire. Privacy was partial, not absolute. Dogs might also be allowed inside, curled at the edge of the bed to add warmth. The chamber was less crowded than the hall, but it was still part of the castle's living ecosystem, a blend of comfort and necessity. A curious anecdote from a 15th century noblewoman's diary reveals that her husband insisted on sleeping with candles lit, convinced that the glow would keep away evil spirits. The result, she complained, was wax dripping onto sheets and smoke clouding the hangings. Superstition, even among the elite, shaped nightly habits in ways both comical and frustrating. Modern experts continue to debate whether these luxuries significantly lengthened or improved noble sleep compared to soldiers. Some suggest that warmth, comfort, and quieter chambers must have made a profound difference. Others note that the responsibility of lordship worrying about sieges, estates, and politics kept nobles awake, with cares just as heavy as the cold kept soldiers restless. Comfort did not always guarantee rest. Still, the contrast is stark. As you curl deeper into the imagined bed, you can feel how privilege wrapped itself not only in fur and feather, but in the illusion of safety. Down below, men snored on straw. Up here, lords and ladies dreamed within curtains and tapestries. Both worlds existed under the same roof, yet they felt like two different planets. And as your eyes close, you remember that between these extremes, soldier and noble, there were countless others: squires, servants, artisans, and travellers. Not everyone fit neatly into straw hall or feather bed. Some drifted between, finding corners, lofts, or chambers of their own. To understand fully how medieval soldiers slept, you must also glimpse these in-between spaces, the overlooked niches of castle life, where sleep happened in more ordinary, muddled forms. The noble's fur-lined chamber fades, and your imagination drifts back down winding staircases into the less glamorous corners of the fortress, the in-between spaces, the nooks and crannies where not soldier or lord, but the in-betweens of castle life, found their rest. Here you discover a quieter truth. Sleep was not confined neatly to the hall or the lord's chamber. It spilled into kitchens, lofts, storerooms, and stairwells. For medieval soldiers, these spaces sometimes became havens when barracks overflowed, or when a man simply longed for a corner of solitude. Medieval records, though sparse, do hint at these improvised sleeping spots. Servants and lower-rank garrison members are sometimes listed as sleeping in the buttery or near the ovens. It makes sense. Warmth lingered where bread was baked or where animals were kept. Soldiers were pragmatic. If the great hall was noisy or crowded, they found other places to lie down. Kitchens especially provided residual heat, long after fires had died in other parts of the castle. Oddly enough, one household account from a French castle mentions a scolding issued to guards found napping in the pantry. The steward complained of crumbs in the straw and rat company. The detail is comical, you picture. Weary men curled beside sacks of grain, brushing vermin away with half-hearted swats. But it also reveals how sleep found its way to places never designed for it, reshaping the architecture of the night. Researchers are still uncertain how common these hidden sleeping spots were. Some argue they were rare exceptions, tolerated only in overcrowded conditions. Others suggest they were far more routine, pointing out that castles were always busy with far more people than their official records imply. Archaeological traces, straw compressed into corners, soot stains on floor niches add weight to the idea that improvised bedding was normal, not unusual. You lower yourself into one of these imagined niches, a corner near the kitchen hearth. The fire has died down, leaving only faint warmth on the stone. The smell is thick with smoke, mingled with yesterday's bread and the sharp tang of onions. A sack of flour becomes your pillow, your cloak, your blanket. It is not comfortable, but it is private, and in a world of communal life, privacy itself feels luxurious. The sensory contrasts are vivid. Instead of the endless drone of snores, you hear only the creak of beams and the drip of water from a cooling cauldron. Instead of the stale odor of 100 men, you breathe the earthy scent of grain and ash. Sleep here feels stolen, fragile, but more personal. The danger, of course, is vermin mice dart across the floor and a rat's tail brushes your boot. Still, exhaustion dulls the disgust, and you drift despite the company. Another peculiar note from castle records. Squires often slept wherever their master's gear was stored. Saddles, armor stands, and weapon racks became makeshift beds. Some slept literally on their lord's horse blankets, preferring the stink of leather to the chaos of the hall. You imagine a boy dozing against a lance rack, his head knocking lightly on wood each time he shifts, too tired to care. Experts remain divided on how these improvised habits shaped morale. Did they provide necessary relief from the communal chaos, or did they fragment the cohesion of garrison life? One perspective holds that allowing soldiers to claim niches made the castle more livable. Another warns that scattered sleeping reduced discipline and created disorder. The debate reflects, once again, the tension between practicality and principle. You think of stairwells, two spiral stone stairs where men sometimes slumped, cloaks wrapped around them, backs against the wall. The constant draft through arrow slits would chill them, yet the solitude may have been worth it. A guard off duty might collapse halfway down a tower stair, snoring quietly while comrades stepped over him. These liminal spaces carried their own strange kind of rest. Even chapel corners sometimes doubled as beds. Priests complained of soldiers trespassing on holy benches, yet the pull of peace and warmth was undeniable. Imagine lying under a carved arch, the faint scent of incense still clinging to the stone, candles long extinguished. Sleep here would feel blessed, perhaps, even if officially forbidden. The dog who has followed you through many nights curls now beside you in the kitchen corner. Its body presses close, its fur carrying the lingering smell of horses and hay. Together you find warmth that the hall denied. The improvisation feels human, instinctive, a search for shelter wherever it may be found. And so you realize that medieval sleep was not just communal or noble, it was opportunistic. Men slept wherever warmth, quiet, or safety offered itself. In this, they resembled travelers and pilgrims as much as soldiers. They adapted, bending the rigid stone walls to their needs, turning castles into patchwork dormitories. As your eyes close, you consider the wider symbolism. Castles were built to withstand siege, to project authority, to embody permanence. Yet every night, their stone was softened by straw nests, cloak tents, kitchen corners, and improvised beds. Soldiers carved comfort out of a fortress, proving that survival was not only about walls and weapons, but about the persistence of sleep. Your thoughts turn toward the dawn that followed such nights. For however uncomfortable, fractured, or improvised, Sleep had to end. The horns and bells of morning roused men to duty, to drills, to the cold day ahead. The next chapter of your story, then, is about those dawn rituals, the way soldiers shook off straw and smoke and prepared for another cycle of hardship. The dark corners of the kitchen fade as the first grey hint of dawn creeps into the castle. Sleep, whether on straw pallets, beneath noble fur, or curled in a kitchen corner, was never endless. Morning arrived with a certainty that no cloak or curtain could delay. For medieval soldiers, dawn was both relief and burden, the promise of warmth from activity, but also the end of whatever fragile comfort the night had offered. Medieval sources consistently describe the start of the day as marked by bells, horns, or shouted calls. Castles with chapels used church bells to signal lauds, the morning prayer, and the sound echoed through courtyards to rouse men for duty. Elsewhere, a simple trumpet blast, or the voice of a sergeant did the job. In some places, dogs barking at the stir of animals became the unintentional alarm clock. Whatever the signal, it cut through the last layers of sleep with brutal clarity. One striking detail recorded in garrison accounts is that soldiers were expected to be up before sunrise when danger loomed. The idea was simple. Dawn was the likeliest time for enemies to attack, taking advantage of bleary eyes and loosened defences. A castle might be at its most vulnerable, just as the night watch changed hands. So men were often roused early, their bodies still aching from broken sleep, forced to stumble into the chill with weapons in hand. Oddly enough, some chroniclers describe soldiers who became so accustomed to this rhythm that they could wake without prompting, their bodies trained by routine. A 14th century account praises a captain whose men rose like birds at the crow of cock, without cry or horn. Whether true discipline or flattery, it suggests how ingrained the cycle of night and morning became in soldierly life. Researchers remain divided on how effective such early rising truly was. Some argue it ensured readiness and reduced surprise attacks. Others suggest it merely increased exhaustion, depriving men of precious rest in already harsh conditions. Without precise records of performance, the debate remains unresolved, though the practice itself is well attested. You imagine yourself roused by the sound of a horn echoing off the stone. Your eyes snap open, dry and gritty from too little sleep. The straw clings to your cloak, a flea bites at your wrist, and your mouth tastes of stale ale. Around you, the hall stirs into chaotic life. Men groaning, dogs stretching, boots thudding on stone as bodies rise reluctantly from the ground. The great fire, burned low during the night, flares again as servants add logs, filling the air with a burst of smoke and light. The sensory world of dawn is sharp and immediate. The cold feels harsher after the cocoon of sleep, biting against exposed skin. The hall smells of sour breath, sweat, and extinguished embers, mingled with the faint promise of breakfast, perhaps porridge or bread already being prepared in the kitchens. The noise grows quickly from silence to cacophony. Coughing, muttered curses, clinking armour, the scrape of swords being belted on. Some soldiers rush to duty straight from sleep, cloaks still askew, hoods pulled low, eyes half shut. Others take a moment to shake straw from their clothes, beat cloaks against the floor, or scratch furiously at fresh flea bites. One or two splash water on their faces from wooden basins, shivering at the shock but grateful for the clarity it brings. Hygiene was minimal, but the ritual of washing or praying at dawn marked the transition from night to day. There's a curious anecdote in a 15th century letter about soldiers who would warm their boots by the embers before putting them on, desperate to avoid the bite of frozen leather. The writer describes men hopping comically on one foot, trying to pull on boots while still half asleep, laughing through their misery. Small details like these reveal how humour and routine softened the harshness of mornings. But the duties were serious. The first task was often manning the walls, replacing the night guard with fresh eyes. Soldiers trudged upward, spears in hand, while others moved to the stables, tending horses before breakfast. Work began immediately, water drawn, weapons checked, fires stoked. Sleep's residue clung to them, but responsibility brooked no delay. Experts continue to puzzle over how this relentless cycle affected long-term health. Did soldiers adapt to broken nights followed by early mornings, or did it grind them down steadily? Some argue that the communal nature of castle life, shared meals, shared duties, helped normalize the fatigue, creating collective endurance. Others insist the evidence of chronic illness and shortened lifespans suggests otherwise. The truth, as always, lies between resilience and attrition. You walk in step with the others now, climbing toward the battlements as dawn spills across the horizon. The sky is pale pink, the air crisp, your body still sluggish. Behind you, the hall is emptying, straw left, scattered like the imprint of vanished dreams. Ahead, the world beyond the walls stirs, and the day's work begins. And yet, as you grip your spear and breathe the sharp morning air, you realize that the night has done its job. However imperfectly, however miserably you slept, you survived. And so did the men around you. The cycle continues. Night gives way to dawn, fatigue gives way to duty, and the castle lives another day. But what of memory? For even as the day begins, the experiences of the night linger, etched into the body, carried in scars of fatigue, shaped into stories passed from man to man. As you trudge forward, you understand that sleep in the medieval castle was more than just survival. It was a ritual, a test, a story in itself. And it is those memories, retold around fires and in chronicles, that shaped the image of how soldiers endured the cold without freezing to death. The horn's echo fades, but the memory of nights in a medieval castle lingers like smoke clinging to wool. You followed soldiers through every phase of darkness, sharing cloaks in drafty halls, burrowing in haylofts above stables, warming your hands over braziers, scratching at vermin, listening to snores, and enduring broken sleep shaped by seasons, family, fatigue, and fear. By now, you understand that to sleep in a castle was not a single experience. It was a tapestry woven from countless small strategies, none perfect, all necessary. The written record makes plain that survival depended on layering of clothing, of people, of improvisations. Cloaks became blankets, hoods became heaters, straw became mattresses, and fire became both comfort and threat. Each soldier adapted differently. One curled by the hearth, another dug into damp straw, another hid in a corner near the kitchens. There was no universal bed, no single solution, only endless combinations of wool, stone, smoke, and ingenuity. One striking anecdote from a siege in Flanders tells of soldiers taking turns to sleep directly on the warm stones of the kitchen hearth after baking bread. The steward complained that the stones cracked from repeated use, but the men insisted warmth was worth the risk. This tiny story captures the ingenuity, desperation, and humor that colored every medieval night. Scholarly opinion remains divided about whether these strategies truly protected men from the cold or merely lessened suffering. Some argue that cloaks, braziers, and body heat made castle life tolerable enough that soldiers avoided widespread hypothermia. Others emphasize the prevalence of illness, chronic coughs, fevers, and lung ailments as proof that no amount of wool could truly defend against the damp. Both views contain truth, and the uncertainty itself reflects the fragmentary nature of history. You picture yourself one last time, lying among the soldiers in the hall. The fire has burned down, cloaks are pulled tight, straw rustles under shifting bodies. Around you, the symphony of snores rises again, blending with the soft whimper of a child and the sigh of a dog. Your hood is drawn low, your shift clings damp against your skin, but for the moment you are alive, warm enough, and almost at peace. The sensory world closes around you. Smoke lingers faintly in your nostrils, mixed with sweat and wool. The draught tickles your cheek, but your cloak blocks most of it. The scratch of fleas is still there, but you are too tired to care. Your ears fill with breathing, steady and constant, and it begins to sound like the heartbeat of the castle itself. You let it lull you, eyes drifting shut, body surrendering to sleep. Oddly, this surrender is what makes medieval sleep most recognizable across centuries. However different the conditions, the essence remains familiar. Exhaustion softened by warmth, discomfort masked by closeness, fear dulled by dreams. You've lived it in imagination, they lived it in reality, and in both, survival meant letting go, if only for a few hours. Some final reflections from historians suggest that these nightly struggles shaped soldiers' identities as much as battle did. Sharing straw and cloaks built camaraderie. Enduring vermin and drafts fostered humor. Rising at dawn despite exhaustion proved discipline. Sleep was not an afterthought of war. It was part of the endurance that defined a soldier's worth. To sleep without freezing was, in its way, another victory. As you rest in this final vision, the story comes full circle. You've learned how soldiers in medieval castles slept without succumbing to the cold, by layering garments, sharing heat, improvising shelters, rationing fuel, and above all, enduring. It was never comfortable, rarely healthy, but it was enough. Enough to last the night, enough to rise with the dawn, enough to fight another day. Now, dim the lights in your own room. Let the echoes of stone halls and straw pallets fade. Allow the imagined smoke and cloaks to dissolve into the quiet of your present bed. You are no longer in the castle. You are safe, warm, and far removed from drafts and fleas. Let your breath slow. Let the night soften. And let sleep deep, modern, merciful sleep carry you away. The story fades into stillness now. You are no longer pressed shoulder to shoulder with weary soldiers, nor curled in a hayloft above steaming horses. You are here, in your own bed, with the simple gift of silence and warmth. The echoes of medieval nights linger only faintly, like distant bells, reminding you of how far you are from the hardship of stone walls and draughty halls. Imagine the soldiers you walked beside, how they pulled cloaks tight, curled around dogs, and huddled near fading embers. They endured nights that seemed endless, broken by cold winds and noisy snores. And yet, despite everything, they slept. Their bodies found rest where they could, teaching us that sleep is not about perfection but persistence. Now, picture those embers dying into ash. The last glow fades, the hall darkens, and the chorus of snores slows into steady breaths. A calm spreads, a quiet rhythm that carries the whole castle into slumber. Even the rats pause, even the wind softens for a moment, as if the world itself honors the need for rest. Let that calm reach you. Feel your body grow heavier, your breath deepen, your thoughts loosen. You are far warmer than they ever were, far safer, far more comfortable. Allow gratitude to soften your heart and quiet your mind. You have blankets instead of cloaks, silence instead of snores, and peace instead of fear. Drift now, slowly, gently, into your own night. Let the story dissolve, leaving only calm. The castle walls recede, the draught fades, and all that remains is the soft rhythm of your breath. Sleep is waiting, patient and welcoming, as it has been for all who came before. Sweet dreams.